7 brides came to his mountain. 7 brides left him standing alone. High in the brutal Colorado wilderness, Caleb Harper had survived blizzards that buried cabins whole, winters that froze men solid in their beds, and isolation that drove strong souls to madness. But he couldn't survive the silence of another woman riding away from the life he'd built with his bare hands. Now one last bride was coming up that frozen trail, a seamstress named Elena Morales, who knew nothing about survival, nothing about mountains, and nothing about the man whose previous wives had called him impossible to live with. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind screamed down from the high peaks like a living thing with teeth, tearing at the corners of Caleb Harper's cabin with the kind of fury that made even experienced mountain men pull their blankets tighter and pray for morning. But Caleb wasn't praying. He was standing at his window, watching the trail that cut through the aspens below, waiting for the wagon that would bring his 8th attempt at something other men found as naturally as breathing. A wife. The word tasted bitter in his mouth, like old coffee grounds and broken promises. 32 years old, and Caleb had built an empire of solitude. His hands, scarred, calloused, permanently stained with pine resin and forge ash, had carved this life from wilderness that killed weaker men without hesitation. 200 acres of unforgiving mountain terrain, a cabin that stood solid against winds that had flattened lesser structures, livestock that survived because he knew every trick for keeping animals alive when temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. He'd done everything right, everything except the one thing that mattered. The first bride had lasted 9 days. Caleb could still remember her face when she'd stepped off that wagon 3 years ago. Sarah Donovan, 19 years old, pretty as a porcelain doll and just as fragile. She'd taken one look at the cabin, surrounded by nothing but peaks and sky and the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums like water pressure, and her smile had cracked like river ice in spring. "It's very remote," she'd said, her voice small and already defeated. She'd tried. He'd give her that. She'd unpacked her trunk, arranged her things in the bedroom he'd added specifically for a wife, cooked meals from the supplies he'd stocked. But every morning he'd caught her staring down that trail toward civilization, and every night he'd heard her crying when she thought he was asleep. On the 9th day, she'd asked him to take her back to town. "I'm sorry," she'd whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "I thought I could do this. I really did. But I can't breathe up here, Mr. Harper. I feel like the mountains are crushing me." The second bride had been older, sterner. Martha Connolly, 26, a widow who'd written in her letters about needing security and a fresh start. She'd lasted 3 weeks, long enough to see her first real Colorado mountain storm, the kind that buried the world in white and cut you off from everything for days at a time. "You didn't tell me it would be like this," she'd accused him when the storm finally broke, her face pale and her hands shaking. "You didn't tell me we'd be trapped, that there'd be no one, nothing, just this." "This is mountain life," Caleb had replied, confused by what she'd expected. "This is what I said in my letters." "You said remote. You didn't say prison." She'd left the day the trail cleared. 3, 4, 5. They blurred together after a while, each one arriving with hope or determination or desperation, depending on what had driven them to answer a mountain man's advertisement for a wife. Each one leaving with some variation of the same explanation. Too isolated, too quiet, too hard, too lonely. By the 6th bride, Caleb had stopped trying to charm them, stopped making conversation beyond what was necessary, stopped hoping they'd see what he saw when he looked out at these peaks. Not a prison, but a kingdom. Not isolation, but independence. Not silence, but peace. The 6th bride, Catherine, had been different, stronger. She'd lasted almost 2 months, long enough that Caleb had started to think maybe this time would be different. She'd learned to manage the wood stove, helped with the animals, didn't complain about the endless work that mountain living demanded. Then her sister had written from Denver. Their mother was ill. Catherine had gone to visit, promising to return in 3 weeks. The letter had arrived instead. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I tried. But sitting in my sister's parlor, hearing the sounds of the city, seeing other people, I realized what I'd been missing, what I'd given up. I can't come back to that silence. I can't live my whole life with only one person to talk to, no matter how good a man you are. Please forgive me. He'd burned the letter in his stove and hadn't spoken to another human being for 6 weeks. The seventh bride had been the marriage broker's idea of a solution. You need someone practical, Mrs. Hewitt had written from her office in Denver. Someone who knows hardship, not these city girls looking for adventure or security. Someone who understands work. Her name had been Rebecca Cole, 30 years old, plain-faced and plain-spoken. She'd grown up on a hardscrabble farm in Kansas, buried 2 brothers to scarlet fever and a father to drink. She knew hard work, knew deprivation, knew how to make do with nothing. She'd lasted 6 weeks and 3 days. It's not the work, she'd told him when she asked to leave, her voice quiet but firm. I can work. I've worked my whole life. It's not even the isolation. I'm used to being alone with my thoughts. Then what? Caleb had asked, genuinely baffled. Rebecca had seemed content. She'd never complained, never cried, never stared longingly down the trail. It's you, Mr. Harper. The words had hit him like a mule kick to the chest. You're a good man, fair, honest. You work hard and you don't drink, and you've never laid a hand on me in anger, but you're not here. You're present in body, but there's nothing of you that reaches out to another person. Living with you is like living with a well-made piece of furniture. Useful, solid, but not alive. Not in the ways that matter between 2 people. She'd gathered her things while he stood silent, unable to form words around the truth of what she'd said. I need more than shared space and divided labor, she'd continued, her rough hands folding the same dress she'd arrived in. I need someone who talks to me like I'm a person, not just another task to be managed. Someone who notices when I'm sad or tired or pleased about something. I'm 30 years old, Mr. Harper. If I'm going to spend the rest of my life with someone, I need to actually live with them, not just exist in the same house. She'd left on a Tuesday morning, and Caleb had spent the rest of that day splitting wood until his hands bled and his shoulders screamed. That had been 4 months ago. 4 months of silence broken only by wind and ravens and the occasional wolf howl echoing off the peaks. 4 months of cooking for one, of talking to his horse because there was no one else, of sitting by the fire at night with no company but his own thoughts circling like buzzards. He'd written to Mrs. Hewitt one last time. One more. Send me one more candidate. If this doesn't work, I'm done. I'll live alone. Better that than keep putting women through this, keep putting myself through this. One more try. Mrs. Hewitt's response had arrived 3 weeks later. Her name is Elena Morales, 28 years old, seamstress by trade, though she's done various work to survive. Spanish father, Irish mother, both deceased. No living family that she mentions. She's been corresponding with me for 2 months about placement, and I'll be honest with you, Caleb, she's not like the others. She's not running from anything, and she's not running toward romance or rescue. When I asked her why she wanted to live on a mountain with a man she'd never met, she said, "Because pretending to fit into places where I don't belong has stopped working. I'd rather be honest about being different somewhere it doesn't matter." I don't know if she's right for you. I don't know if anyone is. But she's the only woman who's read your honest advertisement, including the part about previous brides leaving, and still said yes. She leaves Denver on the 15th. She should reach you by the 20th if the weather holds. Today was the 20th of February, and the weather had not held. Caleb watched the trail through the early afternoon gloom, snow beginning to fall in that deceptive way that meant a real storm was building. The temperature was dropping fast. He could feel it in the way the wind changed, and how the smoke from his chimney flattened and spread instead of rising. She wouldn't make it today. Couldn't. No sensible wagon driver would push into weather like this. He turned from the window, moving through his cabin with the efficient economy of a man who wasted no motion. The fire needed building up. The animals would need extra feed before the storm hit fully. He had work to do, whether or not, bride or not. He was in the barn, forking hay to his 2 horses and the milk cow, when he heard it. Wagon wheels. Harness jingling. A man's voice cursing steadily and creatively about mountains and snow and people fool enough to live in them. Caleb set down the pitchfork and walked to the barn door. The wagon was coming up the last stretch of trail, the driver hunched against the wind. his team of horses laboring through snow that was already ankle-deep and rising. In the back of the wagon, surrounded by trunks and bundles, sat a figure wrapped in so many layers of wool and fur that Caleb couldn't make out any features, except dark eyes watching the cabin with an expression he couldn't read. He walked out to meet them, snow crunching under his boots. "You Harper?" the driver called down, his face red with cold and irritation. "I am." "Well, praise the saints, because I'm not driving back down that trail today. Storm's coming in hard." The driver jerked his thumb toward his passenger. "One bride as ordered. Where can I stable my team?" "Barn's behind the cabin. There's room and feed." The driver was already climbing down, clearly more concerned with his horses than with introductions. Caleb moved to the back of the wagon where the bundled figure was attempting to stand, moving stiffly after what must have been a brutal ride. "Miss Morales?" "Mr. Harper." The voice was lower than he'd expected, slightly hoarse from cold. "Would you mind helping me down? I can't feel my feet." He reached up, grasping her firmly around the waist, and lifted her down from the wagon. She was heavier than the last few brides, not fat, but solid. Real. She stood for a moment, gripping his arms for balance, her face still hidden in the folds of a wool scarf. "Can you walk?" he asked. "In a moment. The blood needs to remember my legs exist." She spoke matter-of-factly, without embarrassment or complaint. After a few seconds, she released his arms and took a careful step, then another. "Yes, I can walk." "The cabin?" "This way." He grabbed two of her trunks, lighter than he'd expected, and led her toward the door while the driver began unhitching his team, still cursing under his breath. Inside, the cabin was warm from the fire he'd built up earlier. Caleb set the trunks down and turned to find Elena unwrapping herself from the layers of wool and fur, revealing features that surprised him in their ordinariness. She wasn't beautiful, not like Sarah had been, with her delicate features and golden hair. Elena's face was strong-boned and olive-skinned, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her mouth wide and her nose slightly crooked as if it had been broken once. She looked like someone who'd lived, not someone who'd been protected from living. She met his gaze directly, her dark eyes assessing him with the same frank evaluation he was giving her. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "You're—" Caleb paused, unsure how to finish that sentence honestly without being rude. "Older than my photograph?" Elena finished for him, a slight smile touching her mouth. "That was taken 6 years ago. I apologize for the deception, though Mrs. Hewitt said you specified you didn't care about looks." "I don't." "Good. Because I stopped being decorative around 23. She turned slowly, taking in the cabin with the same assessing gaze she'd given him. One large room serving as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space. A bedroom door opened to one side. She could see the bed he'd built from pine logs, the simple furniture, the window looking out toward the peaks, a loft above for storage. Everything clean, functional, built to last. "You made all of this?" she asked. "Most of it, traded for some pieces. It's solid work." She walked to the stove holding her hands over it. "The previous women who left, was it the isolation that drove them away? Or something else?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. Every other bride had tiptoed around the subject of his failures or ignored it entirely or waited for him to bring it up. "Most said isolation," Caleb replied carefully. "One said it was me." Elena glanced at him over her shoulder. "Was she right?" "Probably." She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Mrs. Hewitt told me you'd written honestly about the conditions here. The work, the weather, the loneliness. She said most of the women who came expected it to be different than you'd described. Easier or more romantic or changeable somehow." "That's about right. I'm not most women, Mr. Harper." She turned fully to face him, her hands still extended toward the warmth. "I've read your letters 3 times. I know what this is, what it isn't. I'm not here because I misunderstood or because I'm running away from something worse. I'm here because this is what I want. You want isolation? Hard work? Months of snow? I want honesty. I want purpose. I want to build something that lasts instead of just surviving from one day to the next." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not desperation, but determination. I've spent 10 years being what other people needed me to be. Quiet when they wanted quiet. Cheerful when they wanted cheerful. Small and invisible when that was easier for everyone. I'm done with that. I'd rather be alone on a mountain than surrounded by people and still lonely. Before Caleb could respond, the door banged open and the wagon driver stomped in, bringing a gust of snow and cold air with him. "Storm's here," he announced, brushing snow from his coat. "I'll be needing to stay the night if you've got space. Won't be safe to travel until it clears." "Loft," Caleb said, gesturing upward. "Blankets in the chest." The driver nodded and began hauling himself up the ladder, still muttering about mountains and people fool enough to live in them. Elena watched him go, then turned back to Caleb. "Should I unpack, or would you prefer to wait until you've decided whether you want me to stay?" The question was fair, practical, and it highlighted exactly what Rebecca had accused him of, treating people like tasks to be managed, problems to be solved. "Unpack," Caleb said. "I don't make decisions that fast." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Elena's face. "Fair enough. Which trunk first?" They worked in silence, Elena efficiently organizing her belongings in the bedroom while Caleb prepared an evening meal. Venison stew with the last of his stored vegetables, bread he'd baked 2 days ago. The driver came down from the loft long enough to eat, then retreated again, clearly having no interest in whatever awkward courtship was supposed to happen between a mountain man and his mail-order bride. As darkness fell and the wind howled louder, Caleb found himself stealing glances at Elena. She moved around the cabin like someone taking inventory, noting where things were, how the space was organized. She didn't rearrange anything or comment on his housekeeping. She simply learned the terrain. "The bedroom," Caleb said abruptly, breaking a silence that had stretched through most of the meal. "It's yours. I'll sleep by the fire." Elena looked up from her stew. For how long? The question was more complicated than it sounded, and they both knew it. "Until we know each other better," Caleb said carefully. "And if we never do? If I'm like the others, unsuited for this life, unable to adapt? Then you'll leave, and I'll still sleep by the fire." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable in the firelight. "Mrs. Hewitt said you're an honest man, that you don't make false promises or hide who you are. Was she right about that too?" "I try to be." "Then I'll be equally honest." Elena set down her spoon, giving him her full attention. "I'm not delicate. I don't need protection from hard truths or difficult realities. If you have doubts about me, about whether this arrangement can work, I'd rather hear them now than discover them slowly through silence and distance." Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope. He'd learned not to trust that feeling, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sense of meeting someone who spoke his language. "I have doubts," he admitted. 7 women have looked at this life and decided it wasn't worth living, that I wasn't worth living with. I don't know what makes you different, if anything does. What makes me different is that I'm not looking for the same things they were. Elena's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. I don't need you to complete me or rescue me or provide me with a better version of the life I had before. I need a partnership. Real work toward a real goal. A life that means something because we built it deliberately, not because it looks like what we're supposed to want. And if it's harder than you think, if the isolation becomes suffocating, if you wake up one day and realize you've made a terrible mistake, then I'll tell you, directly, the same way I'm talking to you now. She met his gaze without flinching. But I won't run at the first difficulty or the 10th. I've survived worse than weather and loneliness, Mr. Harper. The question isn't whether I can endure this life. The question is whether you can endure having someone here who won't pretend to be something she's not just to keep the peace. Outside, the storm was building to full fury now, wind slamming against the cabin walls like fists, snow hissing against the windows. The kind of storm that could bury the trail for days, that could trap you for a week or more if it settled in to stay. Caleb looked at this woman who'd arrived in the teeth of a blizzard, who spoke to him like an equal instead of a solution or a disappointment, who seemed neither impressed by his survival nor frightened by his isolation. "I can endure that," he said quietly. "The question is whether that's enough. Every woman who's left has told me, in one way or another, that I'm not enough, that there's something missing in me, something broken or absent that makes a real marriage impossible." Elena tilted her head slightly, considering. What do you think they meant by real marriage? Romance, I suppose. Affection. The kind of connection that makes people happy to be together instead of just tolerant of each other's presence. And do you want those things? The question should have been simple. It wasn't. I don't know, Caleb said, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. I know I want someone here. I know the silence has gotten louder every year. I know I built that bedroom for a reason, and not just because married men are supposed to have wives. But whether what I want is the same as what other people call love or romance or happiness, I couldn't tell you. Elena was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table between them. When she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been. My mother used to tell me that love was supposed to feel like being struck by lightning. Sudden, overwhelming, transformative. She loved my father that way, passionate and consuming until the day he died. Then she withered without him because she'd built her whole life around that feeling. Elena looked up, her dark eyes steady. I don't want to be struck by lightning, Mr. Harper. I want to build a fire, deliberately, carefully. Something that provides warmth and light, and doesn't burn out the moment the initial spark fades. Something in Caleb's chest loosened slightly. Not all the way. He'd learned not to trust too quickly, not to hope too much, but enough to breathe a little easier. That sounds more sustainable, he said. It sounds lonely to people who want lightning, Elena replied. But to someone who's tired of pretending to feel things they don't, it sounds like relief. The driver shifted in the loft above them, his snoring cutting through their conversation like a saw through wood. Elena glanced upward, then back at Caleb. I should sleep, she said, rising from the table. Morning comes early on a mountain, I imagine. Earlier than in town. Animals need tending regardless of weather. Then I'll be up to help. She paused at the bedroom door, one hand on the frame. Mr. Harper? Caleb, if we're going to build anything, you should call me Caleb. A small smile touched her mouth. Caleb, thank you for not lying to me about what this is, about who you are. It makes this considerably easier. She disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Caleb sat alone by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and the unfamiliar sounds of another person existing in his space. The rustle of fabric as she changed for bed, the creak of the bed frame under her weight. Small noises that meant he wasn't alone. He'd been alone for 4 months. Before that, for 6 weeks. Before that, through various intervals of days or weeks between brides who arrived and left, each one taking a small piece of his hope with them. But Elena had said something none of the others had. She'd said she didn't want to be struck by lightning. Caleb had been struck by lightning once, when he was 15. He'd been caught in an open meadow during a summer storm, and the bolt had traveled through the ground, up through his feet, and out through his raised hand in a fraction of a second. The impact had thrown him 6 feet, burned his boots, and left him deaf in one ear for 3 days. It had been terrible, painful, terrifying. And he'd had absolutely no interest in repeating the experience. He added another log to the fire, banked the coals for the night, and spread his bedroll on the floor. Through the bedroom door, he could hear Elena's breathing evening out into sleep, untroubled by the storm or the strangeness of her situation. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, for the first time in months, Caleb Harper fell asleep to the sound of someone else breathing in his house. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't dream about the empty trail leading away from his cabin toward a world where 7 women had decided he wasn't worth staying for. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of the first day, Caleb woke to find Elena already up, dressed in practical wool and sturdy boots, standing by the window watching the snow fall. It's beautiful, she said without turning around. Terrible, but beautiful. It'll get worse before it gets better. I assumed so. She moved away from the window as the wagon driver climbed down from the loft, looking considerably less irritable after a full night's sleep and no driving through mountain weather. Is there coffee? There was. Caleb had already started it, along with porridge made from oats and dried apples. They ate in relative silence, the driver making occasional comments about the storm, Elena asking practical questions about the cabin's layout and the location of various supplies. After breakfast, Caleb pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. Animals need feeding, storm or not. I'll come with you, Elena said, already reaching for the wool coat she'd worn the day before. You don't need to. Driver can help if I need it. I'm not staying inside because I don't need to help, Elena replied, her tone matter-of-fact. I'm staying or coming based on whether you want me to learn how things work here. If I'm going to be useful, I need to understand the routines. The driver snorted into his coffee. She's got you there, Harper. Caleb looked at Elena, at her steady gaze and practical stance, and made a decision. Fine, but stay close. Visibility is going to be near zero between here and the barn. It was worse than zero. It was negative. The snow was falling so thick that Caleb could barely see his own hands in front of his face, the wind driving it horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin. He felt Elena's hand grip the back of his coat as they pushed out into the storm, trusting him to navigate the 20 yards between cabin and barn. Inside the barn, the temperature was only marginally better, but at least they were out of the wind. The horses whickered softly, and the cow lowed in complaint about the late breakfast. This is Marcus, and this is Atlas, Caleb said, gesturing to the horses. The cow is just cow. I'm not sentimental about livestock. Elena moved forward, running her hands over Marcus's neck with the confidence of someone who'd been around animals before. They're well kept. Good conformation. Atlas has some scarring on his left foreleg. Old injury? Caught it in some deadfall 2 winters ago. Healed clean, but it bothers him in very cold weather. I'll remember that. She was already helping him fork hay into the stalls, working efficiently without waiting to be told what to do. When they'd finished with the horses, she moved to the cow without prompting, her hands sure on the animal's flank. You've done this before, Caleb observed. My father worked for a ranch in New Mexico before he died. I grew up around horses and cattle. Elena straightened, brushing hay from her skirt. I'm not useless, Caleb. I know how to work. I can see that. They fought their way back to the cabin through the storm, the driver having sensibly remained inside. For the rest of the day, they existed in the strange suspended time that heavy weather creates, cut off from the world, focused on immediate needs, keeping the fire going, preparing meals, maintaining the space. Elena didn't chatter or try to fill the silence with nervous conversation. She simply existed in the cabin, finding tasks without being directed, moving around him rather than waiting for him to move first. By evening, Caleb realized she'd reorganized his kitchen to be more efficient, mended a tear in one of his shirts that had been sitting in a pile for weeks, and improved the draft on his stove by adjusting the damper in a way he hadn't considered. You're a seamstress, he said as she worked on the shirt by firelight, her needle moving with practiced precision. I was. Among other things. She didn't look up from her stitching. I've done whatever work was available, sewing, cooking, cleaning, tending animals, keeping books for a merchant who couldn't read well enough to track his own inventory. You learn to be flexible when you don't have family money or a husband to depend on. Mrs. Hewitt said your parents were dead. No siblings. No siblings. My mother died when I was 16, my father 2 years later. I've been on my own since I was 18. 10 years. 10 years of making her own way, answering to no one, surviving by her wits and her willingness to work. It explained a lot about the woman sitting across from him, self-contained and practical. Why marriage now? Caleb asked. Why give up that independence? Elena's needle paused for just a moment before continuing. Because independence without purpose becomes isolation. I was alone in Denver the same way you were alone on this mountain, surrounded by people or surrounded by peaks. It amounts to the same thing if you don't connect with anyone. And you think you'll connect with me? She looked up then, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. I think we're both honest enough to try. That's more than most people start with. On the second day, the driver became restless. How long do these storms typically last? He demanded over breakfast, staring out at the continuing wall of white. 3 days to a week, Caleb replied. Depending. A week? The man looked horrified. I can't sit here for a week. I've got deliveries scheduled, other clients waiting. Then you'll disappoint them. Nobody's traveling in this. The driver spent the rest of the day pacing, making pointed comments about the inconvenience, the isolation, the madness of living somewhere that weather could trap you for days. Elena ignored him. Caleb did the same. They'd both chosen this life knowing exactly what it meant. That afternoon, while the driver sulked in the loft, Elena asked Caleb about the cabin's construction. You said you built most of it yourself. All of it. Took me 2 summers. Show me. So he did. He walked her through the structure, explaining how he'd chosen the logs, how he'd notched them for maximum stability, how he'd positioned the cabin to take advantage of winter sun and summer shade. She asked intelligent questions, her seamstress's eye for construction translating well to carpentry. The bedroom, she said, standing in the doorway and examining the frame. It's newer than the rest. Added it 3 years ago, before the first bride. For her specifically, or for the idea of having a wife? Caleb considered the question. Both, neither. I knew I needed more space if someone else was going to live here. Whether it was her or another woman didn't matter much at the time. Elena nodded slowly. It's solid work, like everything else here. You build things to last, don't you? No point building them any other way. No, she agreed. There isn't. That evening she made dinner, a stew from Caleb's stores that somehow tasted better than when he made it, though she'd used the same ingredients. When he commented on it, she shrugged. Spices. You have them, but you don't use them much. Flavor matters, even in simple food, maybe especially in simple food. It was a small thing, trivial even, but it was the first change any of the brides had made that felt like improvement rather than criticism. On the 3rd day, the storm began to break. The wind died down first, then the snowfall lessened from impenetrable to merely heavy. By afternoon, you could see the barn from the cabin windows. By evening, the sky was clearing, revealing stars so bright and close they looked like you could reach up and touch them. I'll leave first light, the driver announced, visibly relieved. Get down the mountain before another storm rolls in. Smart, Caleb agreed. That night, after the driver had retired to the loft for his last sleep in the cabin, Elena stood at the window staring out at the snow-covered landscape glowing under starlight. It really is beautiful, she said quietly. All that power, all that danger, and it creates this. Caleb joined her at the window. Most people just see the danger. Most people aren't looking properly. She glanced at him. The other brides, did you show them this? The beauty alongside the hardship? I tried. They saw what they wanted to see, or what they feared to see. And what do I see? It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She wanted to know what he thought of her perception. You see what's actually here, Caleb said after a moment. Not better or worse than it is, just real. Elena smiled slightly. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in years. Accurate perception as compliment. I like that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead and the snow catch the light like scattered diamonds. Caleb was aware of her presence beside him in a way that felt different from the previous brides. Not uncomfortable, but not quite comfortable either. Something in between. Something that might eventually become familiar. When he leaves tomorrow, Elena said, still watching the stars, it'll be just us. For however long until the next wagon can make it up here. Weeks, probably. Probably. Are you worried? Caleb considered the question honestly. No. Should I be? I don't know. Are you worried I'll turn into one of the others? That the reality of isolation will break me down? Are you worried about that? Elena turned to face him fully, her expression serious in the starlight. No, I'm worried that I'll fit here too well, that I'll prove I can survive the isolation and the work and the silence, and you'll still decide I'm not what you want. That survival isn't enough for a real partnership. The honesty of it struck him. She wasn't afraid of failing. She was afraid of succeeding at the wrong thing. What would be enough? Caleb asked. I don't know yet. That's what makes it frightening. She held his gaze. But I'm willing to find out. The question is whether you are. He thought about 7 women riding away, 7 failures, 7 chances to get it right and getting it wrong every time. He thought about Rebecca's words, that living with him, was like living with furniture. Useful, but not alive. He thought about Elena, who'd arrived in a blizzard and hadn't flinched, who worked without being asked and spoke without pretending, who seemed to understand that not everyone wanted to be struck by lightning. "I'm willing," he said. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of happiness, but it was true, and that seemed more important than pretty words neither of them would believe. Elena nodded, something like relief crossing her face. "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time." "One day at a time," Caleb agreed. The driver left at dawn, his wagon loaded and his team fresh after 3 days of rest. He tipped his hat to Elena, gave Caleb a look that said rather you than me, and headed down the trail that was already starting to pack down under fresh wagon traffic from lower on the mountain. Caleb and Elena watched him go until the wagon disappeared around the first bend. Then they turned back to the cabin, to the work that waited, to the life they were going to attempt to build together. "Where should we start?" Elena asked. Caleb looked at his cabin, at the mountains surrounding them, at the woman standing beside him who'd chosen to be here. "Same place as always," he said, "with what needs doing." And they went inside to begin. The first week after the driver left passed in a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Caleb had expected awkwardness, the uncomfortable dance of two strangers learning to share space. Instead, he found efficiency. Elena rose before dawn without being asked, starting the fire and putting coffee on before he'd even pulled on his boots. She didn't wait for direction. She observed his routines for 2 days, then simply integrated herself into them. When he went to feed the animals, she came with him. When he chopped wood, she stacked it. When he checked his traps along the tree line, she learned the route and the technique. "You set them too close together here," she said on the 4th day, crouched beside a line of rabbit snares. "They'll start avoiding this whole section if they associate it with danger." Caleb looked at the placement he'd been using for 3 years. "They haven't yet." "Haven't they? How many rabbits did you catch here last winter?" He thought about it. Maybe a dozen, through the whole season. "And how many the winter before?" 20, maybe 25. Elena stood, brushing snow from her skirt. "They're learning. Animals aren't stupid. Spread these out more. 200 yards between each trap instead of 50. You'll catch more with fewer snares." She was right. Over the next week, following her advice, he caught 3 rabbits where he'd been catching none. It was a small thing, but it marked a shift. She wasn't just surviving in his world, she was improving it. But the ease of their work routines didn't translate to everything else. In the evenings, after the chores were done, and the cabin was warm and the darkness pressed against the windows, they sat on opposite sides of the room in a silence that felt less comfortable and more weighted. Elena would sew by lamplight, mending his clothes or working on something of her own. Caleb would carve, handles for tools, small repairs, anything to keep his hands busy. They existed in the same space without truly occupying it together. On the 8th night, Elena set down her sewing and looked across at him. "We need to talk." Caleb's hand stilled on the knife he'd been sharpening. Those 4 words, in his experience, never led anywhere good. "About?" "About the fact that we're living like polite strangers instead of people trying to build something together." Her tone wasn't accusatory, just factual. "We work well together. The daily tasks, the routines, those are fine. Better than fine. But the moment the work stops, we retreat to separate corners like 2 cats unsure of each other's territory." "I thought you wanted honesty over romance, practical partnership over—" "I do," Elena interrupted, "but practical partnership requires communication, trust, the kind of familiarity that comes from actually knowing each other, not just knowing each other's work habits." Caleb set down the knife carefully. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Nothing. Something more than what tasks need doing tomorrow." She leaned forward, her dark eyes catching the lamplight. "Tell me about the 7th bride. Rebecca. The one who said living with you was like living with furniture." The request hit harder than expected. "Why her specifically?" "Because she's the one who identified the problem. The other 6 left because of the mountain, the isolation, the hardship. But Rebecca left because of you. And if we're going to make this work, I need to understand what she saw that made her leave." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in his mind like one of the stones he sometimes collected from the creek bed, examining it from all angles before deciding if it was worth keeping. She wasn't wrong, he finally said, about me being absent, even when I was present. Absent how? I don't know how to be the kind of man women expect, the kind who talks about feelings or notices small things or makes conversation just to fill silence. He met Elena's gaze directly. I notice when a horse is favoring a leg, or when the wind's changing direction, or when the firewood supply is running low. But I don't notice when someone's wearing a new dress, or when they're sad about something that happened 3 days ago, or when they want me to ask questions I haven't thought to ask. Elena absorbed this without visible reaction. Did Rebecca tell you what she needed? She tried. Said she wanted me to talk to her like a person, not a task. To notice her moods, to care about things that mattered to her even if they didn't matter to survival. Caleb picked up the knife again, turning it over in his hands. But I didn't know how, still don't. She'd be quiet, and I'd assume she wanted quiet. She'd be busy, and I'd leave her to her work. Seemed respectful at the time. Apparently it was just neglectful. Was she happy here before she decided to leave? I thought so. She seemed content with the work, capable with the animals, comfortable with the isolation. He paused. But I suppose that's the problem. I was measuring her happiness by the same standards I'd measure a good horse or a productive milk cow. Is it healthy? Is it performing its function? Is it well maintained? I never thought to ask what she actually felt about any of it. Elena was quiet for a moment, her fingers resuming their work on the fabric in her lap. Automatic. Meditative. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. My mother used to say that my father could read her thoughts, that he knew what she needed before she asked, understood her moods without explanation, anticipated her wants like magic. She pulled a stitch tight. After he died, she told me the truth. He didn't read her thoughts. She trained him for 15 years. She told him explicitly what she needed, what different silences meant, what gestures indicated what emotions. She taught him the language of her feelings until it became second nature to him. But it wasn't magic or intuition or soulmate connection. It was just communication and practice. And that worked for them? For 15 years, until he died in a mining accident. Elena's hand stilled. Then it stopped working because she'd built her entire emotional life around a person who wasn't there anymore. She withered without him, literally. Stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped maintaining herself. She died 6 months later, and the doctor wrote heart failure on the certificate, but we both knew it was just giving up. Caleb heard something in her voice he hadn't heard before. Not quite grief, too old and settled for that, but the hollow space where grief used to be. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you this because it taught me something important. She looked up, meeting his eyes. That kind of dependency, that complete intertwining of two people until they can't function separately. Everyone calls it romance. True love denotes the ideal marriage, but I watched it destroy my mother and I decided I never wanted it. What do you want instead? Two people who function fine alone, but choose to function better together. Not because they need each other to survive, but because they genuinely prefer the combined result. She set down her sewing entirely now, giving him her full attention. Rebecca wanted you to be intuitive about her needs, to somehow know what she was feeling and respond appropriately without being told. That's the lightning strike model of relationship, instant, magical understanding. But that's not real, Caleb. That's just two people projecting their fantasies onto each other until reality intrudes. So what's the alternative? We tell each other, directly. When something matters, we say it. When we need something, we ask for it. When we're bothered or pleased or confused or worried, we use our words instead of expecting the other person to read our minds. Elena's expression was earnest now, almost intense. Can you do that? Can you tell me when something's wrong? Or when you're frustrated with me? Or when you actually want to talk instead of sitting in silence? Caleb thought about it honestly. I don't know. I've spent a lot of years not talking about those things. Not sure I'd know where to start. Start now, right now. Tell me one thing that's been bothering you since I arrived. The directness of the request caught him off guard. His instinct was to deny anything was bothering him, to smooth over the question, to maintain the polite surface they'd been operating under. But she'd asked for honesty. And honesty was something he could do, even when it was uncomfortable. "You rearranged my kitchen without asking," he said. Elena blinked. "That's bothering you?" "Some. I had things where they were for a reason. Now I have to relearn where everything is. The reason was that you put things where you first set them down when you built the cabin, not where they're most efficiently located for actual use," Elena countered, but there was no heat in her voice, just fact. "But you're right. I should have asked. Or at least told you I was doing it. I'm used to living alone, making decisions without consultation. I'll try to remember this is your space, too." "Our space," Caleb said. "If you're staying." "Our space," Elena agreed. "So tell me, would you prefer I move everything back? Or can you live with the new arrangement now that you've complained about it?" Despite himself, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "The new arrangement makes more sense, I can admit that." "Good. Then we've just had our first successful negotiation." She picked up her sewing again, but her posture was different now, less guarded, more relaxed. "Your turn to ask me something." "About?" "Anything that will help you understand who I am beyond my work capacity." Caleb considered the hundreds of questions that statement could encompass. Most of them felt too personal, too invasive. But Elena had asked for communication, and communication required risk. "Were you ever married before?" he asked. "Mrs. Hewitt's letters said you were 28 and unattached, but they didn't say if you'd been married previously." Elena's hands continued their steady work, but something shifted in her expression, not quite pain, but acknowledgement of old wounds. "Yes, for 3 years. I married when I was 21. Caleb waited, sensing there was more. His name was Thomas Webb. He was a clerk in a shipping office in Santa Fe. Steady work, decent income, respectable family. Everything a young woman with no family money or prospects should want in a husband. Her voice was carefully neutral. "I convinced myself I loved him because he offered security and seemed kind. He convinced himself he loved me because I was quiet and biddable and didn't make demands." "What happened?" "We discovered that building a life on convenience instead of truth doesn't work." Elena pulled another stitch, her movements precise and controlled. "He wanted a wife who would manage his household, bear his children, and maintain his social standing. I wanted a partner who saw me as a person instead of a function. Neither of us got what we wanted, and we made each other progressively more miserable trying to force it." "How did it end?" "He found someone else, a widow with money and social connections. He asked me for a divorce so he could marry her." Elena's voice was still even, but Caleb heard the edge underneath it. "I could have refused, made it difficult for him, demanded compensation, caused a scandal. But I was so relieved to have an exit that I agreed immediately. Signed the papers, took my belongings, and left Santa Fe the same week." That must have been hard. "It was freeing. Terrible and humiliating and freeing all at once." She looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. "I learned something important from that marriage, Caleb. I learned that the thing people call love, the butterflies and passion and desperate need for another person, that fades. It always fades. And if there's nothing underneath it but convenience or social expectation or fear of being alone, you end up trapped with a stranger you've promised your life to." "Is that why you answered my advertisement? Because you wanted something different?" "I answered your advertisement because you were honest about what you were offering. No romance, no pretty promises, no pretense that this would be easy or magical or anything other than hard work toward a mutual goal." She set down her sewing again, giving him her full attention. "You wrote in your letters that you needed a partner for a difficult life, not a decoration for an easy one. That was the first honest thing any man had said to me about marriage." Caleb felt something shift in his understanding of the woman across from him. She wasn't here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because she'd made a deliberate choice based on clear-eyed assessment of what she actually wanted from life. "What else do you want?" he asked, "beyond honesty and partnership?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I want to build something that lasts, something I can look at in 20 years and know I created it deliberately, not just let it happen to me. I want work that matters and space to think, and the kind of quiet that comes from peace instead of loneliness. She paused. And I want to be known, actually known, not as someone's wife or someone's employee or the person who performs certain functions, just seen as myself. Does that make sense? Yes. What about you? What do you want? It was a fair question. She'd been vulnerable. Now it was his turn. I want someone who stays, Caleb said simply. Not because they have no other options, but because they choose to. I want to stop wondering when the next person will leave. I want to build something permanent instead of temporary. And I want... He hesitated, unsure how to articulate something he barely understood himself. Say it, Elena encouraged, even if it sounds foolish. I want to matter to someone, not just as a provider or a builder or someone who keeps them alive, but as a person they're glad to know. The admission felt like pulling an arrow from a wound, painful but necessary. 7 women have looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the effort of staying. I want to know what it feels like to be someone's first choice instead of their last resort. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. You understand that's not something I can promise you right now, she finally said. We barely know each other. I can promise I won't leave at the first difficulty. I can promise I'll communicate honestly and work toward building something real. But whether you'll matter to me the way you're describing, that takes time, shared experience, trust that has to be earned on both sides. I know. But I can tell you this. She leaned forward slightly. I'm here because I chose to be, not because a marriage broker pressured me or because I had no alternatives or because I needed rescue. I had other options, easier options. I could have stayed in Denver, taken a position with a dressmaker who'd offered me steady work, lived a comfortable if unremarkable life, but I chose this instead. I chose you. That might not be everything you want, but it's not nothing. Caleb absorbed her words, turning them over the same way he'd turned over her earlier questions. She was right. It wasn't nothing. 7 women had been sent to him by circumstance or desperation. Elena had come by choice. Thank you, he said quietly, for telling me that. Thank you for asking what I wanted instead of just assuming you knew. Elena picked up her sewing again, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. The weighted silence was gone, replaced by something more comfortable. We should do this more often. Talk, ask questions, figure each other out. Agreed. They worked in companion silence for a while longer, the fire crackling and the wind whispering against the walls. Then Elena spoke again, her tone lighter. Tell me about the cabin. Not the construction, you already explained that. Tell me why you chose this location specifically. There must be easier places to build in these mountains. Caleb set aside his knife, surprised by the question. No one had ever asked him that before. The view, he said, from the eastern window. In the morning, when the sun comes up over those peaks, the whole valley turns gold. Everything, the snow, the trees, even the air itself, just glows. I saw it once when I was scouting locations, and I knew this was where I wanted to wake up every morning for the rest of my life. Elena stood and walked to the window he'd indicated, though there was nothing to see now but darkness and stars. Show me tomorrow, when the sun comes up. It's early, before dawn. I'll be awake. And she was. When Caleb rose the next morning in the pre-dawn darkness, Elena was already at the window, wrapped in a wool blanket and watching the eastern sky begin to lighten. They stood together in silence as the sun crept over the mountain peaks, transforming the world exactly the way Caleb had described. The snow caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 shades of gold and pink and amber. The valley below emerged from shadow like something being born, and the trees stood black and sharp against the brightening sky. Oh, Elena breathed. Oh, that's... Worth the isolation? Caleb asked quietly. Worth everything, she said, and there was something in her voice. Wonder, maybe, or recognition, that made him think she actually understood. They fell into new patterns after that conversation. Each evening, after the work was done, they would sit and talk, not about tasks or plans or practical matters, but about themselves, about the things that had shaped them, the choices they'd made, the people they'd been before they'd ended up on this mountain together. Elena told him about growing up between two cultures, never quite fitting into her father's Spanish heritage or her mother's Irish roots. About learning to sew because it was something she could do alone, without needing to navigate the complicated social dynamics that confused her. About the relief of discovering she was good at something practical, something that had value regardless of whether people liked her or not. Caleb told her about his own childhood on a farm in Missouri, about parents who died when he was 17, leaving him with a younger sister to raise. About working himself nearly to death to keep them both fed until she was old enough to marry a stable man with good prospects. About coming west afterward because there was nothing left for him there, and the mountains called to something in his nature that needed space and silence and challenge. "Do you miss her?" Elena asked. "Your sister?" "Sometimes. But we were never close, even when we lived under the same roof. I was more like her guardian than her brother. Once she was settled, there wasn't much reason to maintain contact." He paused. "She writes twice a year, Christmas and my birthday. Tells me about her children and her husband's business and how well they're doing. I write back with less to say, hard to make mountain life sound interesting in a letter. You could tell her about the sunrise, about what it's like when the first snow falls, or when you see elk moving through the high meadows. She wouldn't understand. She's a city woman now, St. Louis. She thinks I'm crazy for living up here." "Maybe she's right," Elena said with a slight smile. "Maybe we're both crazy." "Probably. But it didn't feel crazy. It felt increasingly like it might actually work." They developed small rituals, morning coffee shared in comfortable silence while watching the sunrise. Evening conversations by firelight, working in tandem on projects that required 4 hands instead of 2. Elena taught Caleb how to season food properly, how to make bread that didn't taste like sawdust, how to mend clothes so the repairs were nearly invisible. Caleb taught Elena how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to track game through snow, how to split wood so it fell exactly where you wanted it. 3 weeks after her arrival, they were working together to repair a section of the barn roof when Elena suddenly laughed, a genuine, spontaneous sound that startled both of them. "What?" Caleb asked, looking up from the shingle he was nailing. "Nothing. Just, I was thinking how strange this would look to people back in Denver. The seamstress and the hermit, fixing a roof together like it's the most natural thing in the world." "You're not a seamstress anymore." "No," Elena agreed, her smile fading into something more serious. I'm not entirely sure what I am now." "You're my partner," Caleb said, and realized he meant it. Not aspirationally, not hopefully, but factually. Somewhere over the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped being the 8th bride who might leave and had become simply Elena, the person who lived here and worked beside him and understood why he'd chosen this life. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose I am." But that night, for the first time since the wagon had left them alone, Elena seemed restless. She moved around the cabin, straightening things that didn't need straightening, sat down to sew, and then stood up again, walked to the window, and stared out at nothing. "What's wrong?" Caleb finally asked. Elena didn't turn around. "We need to talk about the sleeping arrangements." Every muscle in Caleb's body tensed. This was the conversation he'd been avoiding, the complication he'd been pretending didn't exist. "What about them?" "We can't continue like this indefinitely. Me in the bedroom, you on the floor by the fire." Elena turned to face him, her expression serious. "It's not sustainable, and it's not fair to you. This is your cabin. You shouldn't be sleeping on the floor in your own home." "I'm fine with the arrangement, but I'm not." She crossed her arms. "We're supposed to be building a partnership, remember? That means addressing uncomfortable things directly instead of pretending they don't exist." Caleb set down the piece of harness he'd been mending. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we need to decide what this marriage actually is. Are we partners living in the same house, or are we husband and wife in the full sense?" Elena's voice was steady, but he could hear the tension underneath it. "Because right now we're in this strange middle ground, where we work together and talk together and share a life, but we're still sleeping in separate spaces like strangers. I told you, until we know each other better." "And how much better do we need to know each other? We've spent 3 weeks living in close quarters, sharing every meal, working side by side every day. We talk more honestly than most married couples I've known. At what point does knowing each other better become an excuse to avoid making a real commitment? The accusation stung because it was accurate. He had been using it as an excuse, though he hadn't fully acknowledged it to himself until she said it out loud. "I'm not avoiding commitment," Caleb said, but even to his own ears it sounded defensive. "Aren't you? We're legally married. We live together, work together, plan together. But you won't share a bed with me because we might not work out?" Elena shook her head. "That's exactly what avoiding commitment looks like, Caleb. And what if we do this, share a bedroom, consummate this marriage, and then you decide in a month or 6 months that this life isn't what you want? That I'm not what you want? At least right now you could leave cleanly. But if we—" He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. "If we have sex, you mean. You can say the words, Caleb. We're adults." "Fine. If we have sex and then you leave, it'll be worse, more complicated, harder to recover from." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read her expression. "You're terrified," she finally said, and it wasn't a question. "Of course I'm terrified." The admission came out harsher than he'd intended. 7 women have left me. 7. Each one taking a piece of whatever hope I had that this could work. You're number 8, Elena. The last one I'm willing to try for. And if you leave too, then what? You'll be alone on your mountain, exactly like you were before I came? She stepped closer, her dark eyes intent on his. "Let me tell you something about fear, Caleb. I'm terrified too. Terrified that I've made another mistake, that I've traded one uncomfortable situation for another, that I'm going to discover I'm just as bad at this marriage as I was at the last one. But we can't build anything real from a foundation of fear and self-protection. What do you suggest instead? Risk, actual risk. Not the safe, careful version where we keep our escape routes open and our hearts guarded. Real commitment." Elena's voice softened slightly. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Caleb. I'm asking you to be my husband in more than just name. To take the same leap of faith I took when I got on that wagon and came up this mountain." Caleb felt the weight of her words, the truth of them. She was right. He'd been playing it safe, maintaining distance under the guise of respect and caution. But safety wasn't the same as partnership. Protection wasn't the same as trust. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. I've been with women before, but not like this. Not in the context of trying to build something permanent. Neither have I. My first marriage, Thomas and I never really connected that way. It was obligation and duty and going through the motions." Elena's expression turned wry. "So we'll figure it out together, the same way we figured out everything else. Badly, at first, probably. Awkwardly, but honestly." "Honestly," Caleb repeated. "So here's my honest question. Do you want to try? Not just the physical aspect, but the real commitment it represents? Being actual partners instead of roommates who work well together?" He thought about the past 3 weeks, about morning coffee and evening conversations, and the gradual comfort they'd developed, about Elena's laugh when they'd fixed the roof, about the way she'd looked at the sunrise he'd shown her with genuine wonder instead of polite appreciation. He thought about the alternative, continuing as they were, safe and careful and never quite committed, until one or both of them decided it wasn't enough and she became the 8th woman to leave. "Yes," he said, "I want to try." Elena nodded slowly. "Then tonight, we share the bedroom. We stop pretending this is temporary or uncertain. We commit fully to building this together, whatever that looks like. And if it's awkward or uncomfortable then we'll talk about it. In the morning, like adults." She gave him a small smile. "Remember, communication and practice. That's how people learn each other." So that night, after the fire was banked and the cabin was settling into darkness, Caleb gathered his bedroll and followed Elena into the bedroom he'd built 3 years ago for a wife he'd never really had. They undressed in awkward silence, backs to each other, the intimacy of shared space suddenly overwhelming. The bed, solid pine, wide enough for 2 but never used that way, felt enormous and too small simultaneously. Elena slid under the quilts first, moving to what had become her side over the past weeks. Caleb followed, acutely aware of every sound, every movement, every inch of distance between them. They lay in the darkness, not touching, both staring at the ceiling. "This is ridiculous," Elena finally said. "We faced down blizzards and repaired roofs and field-dressed rabbits together, but we can't figure out how to share a bed." Despite the tension, Caleb felt a laugh escape. "It does seem disproportionate." "Come here," Elena said, and when he turned toward her, she was already moving closer, closing the distance he'd been too uncertain to cross. Her hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool and slightly rough from work. "We don't have to do anything tonight except sleep in the same bed. We're not performing for an audience. There's no script to follow. We just figure it out as we go." Her hand in his felt like an anchor, real, solid, present. "Okay," Caleb said. They fell asleep like that, hands linked, breathing gradually sinking, the mountain silence wrapping around them like a blanket. It wasn't passion or lightning or the romance that stories promised, but it was real and chosen, and somehow that felt more significant than any of the alternatives. Morning came with pale light filtering through the eastern window, and Caleb woke to find Elena already awake beside him, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "You snore," she said. "So do you." "I do not." Like a saw going through green timber. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough to confirm that you also talk in your sleep. Something about fence posts and a broken axle." Elena pushed back the quilts and stood, reaching for the clothes she'd laid out the night before. "Nothing scandalous or poetic, in case you were worried." "I wasn't." Liar. But she said it without heat, and when she glanced back at him, there was the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They dressed and went about their morning routines with a new awareness between them, not uncomfortable, but different. The casual brush of shoulders as they moved around the small space. The brief touch of hands when she passed him his coffee. Small things that meant more now that the boundary between them had shifted. Over breakfast, Elena brought up something that had clearly been on her mind. "We need to talk about what happens when spring comes." Caleb looked up from his plate. "What about it?" "The trail will be passable again. Wagons will be able to make it up here. That means supplies, mail, and—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The option for me to leave if I wanted to." The food in Caleb's mouth suddenly tasted like ash. "Are you planning to?" "No, but we need to discuss it anyway because it's the first real test of whether this is working." Elena set down her fork, giving him her full attention. "Right now we're isolated together. We have to make this work because there's no alternative. But come spring, there will be alternatives. I could leave. You could send me away. We need to know that we're choosing this, not just enduring it because we're trapped." "I'm not trapped." "Neither am I. That's my point." She leaned forward slightly. "When that first wagon comes up the trail, probably sometime in late March or early April, I need to know that you won't be wondering if I'm going to be on it when it leaves. And you need to know the same about me." Caleb thought about the 7 women who'd ridden away, each departure cutting a little deeper than the last. The thought of watching Elena make the same choice made something tighten in his chest. "What are you suggesting?" "That we make a real decision, not just day by day or week by week, but an actual commitment to making this work for the long term." Elena's dark eyes were steady on his. "Before spring comes, before that first wagon arrives, we need to know if this is a real marriage or just a temporary arrangement that's worked out better than expected." "And how do we know that?" "We test it. Not the easy parts. We already know we work well together on practical matters. We test the hard parts, the parts that made the other women leave." Caleb felt a familiar defensiveness rising. "I can't change who I am, Elena. If that's what you're asking, I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking us to be honest about what we actually want from this marriage instead of just assuming we want the same things because we've managed to coexist peacefully for a few weeks." She stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes. "Rebecca left because she felt invisible to you. Martha left because she felt trapped. Sarah left because she felt suffocated by the isolation. We need to know if I'm going to end up feeling those same things. And the only way to know is to push past the polite surface we've been maintaining. You want to fight? I want to disagree. I want to have needs that conflict with yours and see if we can navigate that without one of us retreating or shutting down. Elena's hands stilled on the dishes. I want to know if we can build something that survives conflict, not just cooperation. It made a brutal kind of sense. They'd been on their best behavior with each other, both of them careful not to push too hard or ask too much. But real marriages couldn't survive on careful politeness alone. All right, Caleb said slowly. What do you want that we haven't talked about yet? Elena turned to face him fully, and he could see her gathering her courage for whatever she was about to say. I want children eventually. Not right away. I want to be certain this marriage is solid first. But within a year or two, I want to start a family. She held his gaze. You've never mentioned children in any of your letters or in any of our conversations. I need to know if that's something you want too, or if you built this life planning to keep it just the two of us. The question hit harder than Caleb had expected. He'd built the bedroom for a wife, but he'd never let himself think past that. Never imagined small voices in the cabin or children learning to navigate the mountain the way he had. It had seemed presumptuous to plan for something that required not just a willing woman, but a functional marriage. I don't know, he admitted. I've never thought I'd be good at it. Being a father. Why not? Because I'm not good at the things fathers are supposed to be good at. Patience with questions, playing games, making children feel loved and valued instead of just fed and housed. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. I raised my sister after our parents died, and I kept her alive and healthy and got her educated. But she told me years later that she always felt like a burden to me, like I resented having to care for her instead of building my own life. Did you? Resent her? Yes. The admission tasted bitter. Not because she was a bad person or difficult to care for, just because I was 17 and angry at the world for taking my parents and leaving me with responsibilities I hadn't asked for. I never told her that, never let her see it, but she felt it anyway. Children know these things. Elena came to stand beside him at the window. You were 17 and grieving and overwhelmed. You did the best you could with what you had. That doesn't mean you'd be the same kind of father now. Doesn't it? I'm still not patient, still not warm, still not the kind of man who knows how to show affection easily. But you're honest, and you work hard, and you don't abandon people who depend on you. Elena's voice was quiet but firm. Those are good qualities in a father, Caleb, maybe more important than patience or warmth. And if I'm not? If I raise children the same way I raised my sister, keeping them alive but making them feel like burdens, then we'll talk about it. We'll figure it out together, the same way we're figuring out everything else. She touched his arm, a brief contact that grounded him. But I need to know if you're willing to try, because if children aren't something you want, I need to decide if I can build a life here without them. The weight of the question settled between them. This was the first real test she'd talked about. The first place where their desires might not align, where compromise might not be possible. Caleb thought about the cabin echoing with more than just two adult voices, about teaching a child to read weather and track game and split wood, about the terror of being responsible for shaping another human being when he'd already proven he wasn't particularly good at it. But he also thought about Elena, who'd chosen this life deliberately and was asking for something that clearly mattered to her deeply. I'm willing to try, he said finally. I can't promise I'll be good at it, but I'm willing to try. He felt Elena relax slightly beside him, tension he hadn't fully registered releasing from her shoulders. That's all I'm asking. Willingness. She turned back toward the kitchen. Now your turn. Tell me something you want that you haven't asked for yet. Caleb considered the question. There were practical things, better tools, more livestock, improvements to the cabin. But those weren't what she was asking about. I want you to stop being so careful around me, he said. Elena paused in her work. What do you mean? You edit yourself. I see you start to say something and then decide against it. See you about to touch me and then pull back. See you making yourself smaller or quieter than you actually are. He turned to face her. I know why you're doing it. You don't want to push too hard, don't want to make demands that might drive me away. But it means I'm not seeing the real you. I'm seeing the version you think I can handle. And you want the version you might not be able to handle? I want the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Caleb crossed his arms. You asked me to communicate directly, to tell you when things bother me or when I need something, but you're not doing the same. You're managing me instead of being honest with me. Elena's expression shifted. Surprise, then something that might have been respect. You're right, she said after a moment. I have been managing you. It's a habit from my first marriage. Thomas hated conflict, so I learned to smooth things over, to present everything in the way least likely to upset him. It became automatic. I'm not Thomas. No, you're not. She met his eyes directly. So here's something true and unfiltered. Your habit of retreating into silence when something's bothering you makes me feel like I'm living with a ghost. You're physically present but emotionally absent, and it reminds me of all the ways my first marriage was empty. The words stung, but they were honest. That was what he'd asked for. I don't know how to not do that, Caleb admitted. When something's bothering me, my instinct is to work it out alone. Talking about feelings has always felt like weakness, like exposure, like giving someone ammunition they could use against you later. Elena nodded slowly. My mother used to do that. Use my father's vulnerabilities against him when they fought. She'd remember every fear he'd shared, every doubt he'd expressed, and throw it back at him when she was angry. It destroyed his ability to trust her with the soft parts of himself. So we're both bringing damage from previous relationships, Caleb said. Everyone does. The question is whether we're going to let that damage define this marriage, or whether we're going to work past it. Elena crossed the room to stand in front of him. I'll make you a deal. I'll stop managing you and start being direct about what I actually think and feel. And you'll stop retreating into silence and actually tell me when something's wrong instead of making me guess. Even if it causes conflict? Especially if it causes conflict. Because conflict means we care enough to fight for what we want instead of just accepting whatever's easiest. She held out her hand. Deal? Caleb looked at her outstretched hand, at the determination in her dark eyes, at this woman who kept pushing him toward uncomfortable truths because she believed they could build something real. Deal, he said, and shook her hand. The agreement changed things. Over the following weeks, they stopped being quite so careful with each other. Elena started voicing opinions she'd previously kept to herself, that his method of organizing tools was inefficient, that he needed to clean the barn more frequently, that his tendency to work through meals was both unhealthy and irritating. Caleb started expressing frustrations he'd been swallowing, that she moved his things without asking, that she sometimes made decisions about household matters without consulting him, that her habit of humming while she worked drove him to distraction. They had their first real argument on a gray afternoon in early March, when the snow was beginning to soften, but winter still held the mountain in its grip. Elena had been going through the food stores, taking inventory, and planning for spring planting. She'd come out of the root cellar with a list of supplies they'd need to order when the first wagon came through. We're going to need seeds, lots of them, and I want to expand the garden significantly, at least double what you had last year. She set the list on the table in front of Caleb. Also, we need chickens, at least a dozen hens and a rooster. Caleb glanced at the list, his expression darkening. That's too much. Too much what? Too much food? Too much self-sufficiency? Too much expense? Too much expansion? Too fast? We don't know if... He stopped himself, but Elena caught it. If what? If I'm staying? Her voice went sharp. Is that what you were going to say? We agreed to be honest. Then be honest. Tell me if you're still planning your life around the assumption that I'm going to leave. Caleb stood, his chair scraping against the floor. It's not an assumption. It's risk management. 7 women left, Elena. 7. Investing heavily in expansion based on the idea that you're permanent feels like setting myself up for disappointment. So instead you're going to keep this place barely functional, keep yourself barely surviving, just in case I turn out to be number 8? Elena's voice rose. That's not risk management, Caleb. That's self-sabotage. That's making sure you never have anything good enough to lose. I'm being practical. You're being a coward. The word landed like a slap. Caleb felt anger flare hot in his chest. A coward? I've survived on this mountain for 5 years, built everything you see with my own hands, endured isolation and hardship that would break most men. Don't you dare call me a coward. Then stop acting like one. Elena slammed her hand on the table. You want me to commit fully to this marriage? To believe in it enough to have children and build a real life here? Then you need to commit too. Not just in words, but in actions. That means investing in this place like it's our future, not your temporary shelter until the next disaster strikes. And what happens when you realize this life isn't what you thought it would be? When the reality of being stuck on this mountain with no one but me for company starts to suffocate you the way it did the others? I'm not them, Elena's voice cracked with frustration. How many times do I have to prove that? I've been here through a blizzard. I've learned your routines, adapted to your life, shared your bed. What more do you need from me before you believe I'm actually staying? I need time. I need more than a few weeks before I'm ready to rebuild my entire life around the assumption that this is permanent. They stared at each other across the cabin, both breathing hard, the air between them crackling with tension. You know what I think? Elena said, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. I think you're terrified of wanting this too much, of letting yourself believe it could work. Because if you let yourself hope and I leave anyway, it'll hurt worse than if you keep yourself detached and protected. And you're terrified too, Caleb shot back. Terrified that you've made another mistake, that you've traded one bad marriage for another. So you're pushing for grand gestures and dramatic commitments because if I give them to you, it'll feel like proof that this is different. Elena flinched as if he'd struck her. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the truth of their mutual fears hanging between them like smoke. You're right, Elena finally said, her voice rough. I am terrified. Every day I wake up wondering if this is the day I'll realize I've made a terrible error in judgment. Again. So what do we do? Caleb asked, some of the anger draining from his voice. How do we build something when we're both too scared to fully commit to it? Elena walked to the window, staring out at the gray landscape. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. My father used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. She turned to face him. Maybe we don't wait until we're not scared anymore. Maybe we just do the scared thing anyway. The chickens and the expanded garden? The chickens and the expanded garden. The improvements to the cabin. The plans for children. All of it. She held his gaze. We act like this is permanent even though we're both terrified it isn't. We invest in this life like it's our future, even though we can't guarantee it will be. And if one of us fails, if I leave or you give up, at least we'll know we actually tried instead of just protecting ourselves from disappointment. Caleb thought about what she was proposing. It went against every instinct he'd developed over the past 3 years of watching women leave, every lesson he'd learned about not investing too much in things that might disappear. But Elena was right. They couldn't build anything real from a foundation of fear and self-protection. All right, he said quietly. We'll order the seeds, get the chickens, expand the garden. And you'll stop measuring everything by whether it's safe to lose? I'll try. Elena crossed the room to stand in front of him. That's all I'm asking. Just try. She reached out and took his hand, and he felt the calluses on her palm, evidence of the work she'd been doing, the life she'd been building beside him. Real, solid, present. I'm sorry I called you a coward, she said. I'm sorry I'm still planning around the possibility of you leaving. We're both disasters, Elena said, and despite the heaviness of their conversation, there was the hint of a smile on her face. Probably, Caleb agreed. They stood like that for a moment, hands linked, the afternoon light fading around them. Then Elena squeezed his hand and released it. I'm going to make dinner, something that uses up some of our oldest stores. If we're ordering new supplies, we might as well make room for them. Makes sense. Caleb watched her move into the kitchen area, already planning and organizing, and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope. He still didn't trust that feeling, but something adjacent to it. The possibility that maybe this time could be different, that maybe the 8th attempt might be the one that worked. That night, lying in bed with Elena's warmth beside him, Caleb spoke into the darkness. I need to tell you something. I'm listening. When Rebecca left, she said something I didn't tell you about before. She said I was building a life here, but I wasn't living one. that I'd mistaken survival for purpose. Elena shifted beside him. Do you think she was right? Yes, I built this cabin, carved out this existence, survived winters that killed other men. But I never actually made it into a life worth living. I just made it survivable. He paused, searching for the right words. You being here, it's the first time it's felt like something more than just survival. The first time I've thought about what comes after the next winter instead of just getting through it. Is that good or bad? Terrifying, Caleb admitted, but also good. Maybe mostly good. He felt Elena's hand find his in the darkness, her fingers threading through his. I need to tell you something too, she said. Go ahead. When I was married to Thomas, I used to fantasize about being a widow. Not about him dying exactly, but about what it would feel like to be free of that marriage with a socially acceptable excuse. I felt so guilty about those thoughts. Her voice was quiet in the darkness. I thought it meant I was a terrible person, that there was something wrong with me for wanting out of a marriage that looked perfectly fine from the outside. And now? Now I think I was just a person trapped in the wrong life, trying to imagine a way out. She squeezed his hand. This feels like the right life, or at least like it could be. That's terrifying too, but in a different way. Because you might lose it? Because I might get to keep it? Because I might finally have something I actually want to protect instead of escape from? They fell asleep like that, hands linked, admissions made, a little less guarded than they'd been the night before. The next morning, Caleb woke to find Elena already up and dressed, standing at the table with a piece of paper in front of her. What are you doing? He asked, pulling on his clothes. Making a list, not just of supplies we need, but of everything we want to do this spring. She glanced up at him. You said we should act like this is permanent, so I'm making a plan for permanent things. Caleb came to stand beside her, looking at the list she'd started. Expand garden, build chicken coop, repair east fence, add another window to the cabin, plant fruit trees, build a proper workshop, stock the root cellar for winter, plan for nursery. The last item caught his attention. Nursery? Not immediately, but within a year or two, like we discussed. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact. If we're going to have children, we need space for them. That means another addition to the cabin. Takes time to plan and build properly. Caleb stared at the list, at the life it represented. Not just survival, but actual living, growth, future. This is a lot of work. Yes. It'll take most of the summer just to get the basic expansion done. Probably. And if... He stopped himself, the old fear rising. If I leave, Elena finished for him, then you'll have a bigger cabin, a productive garden, fresh eggs, and the satisfaction of knowing you actually tried to build something instead of just protecting yourself from loss. She set down her pencil and turned to face him. But I'm not leaving, Caleb. I need you to start believing that. How can you be so sure? Because I've had 3 chances to leave already. When the storm ended and the driver offered to take me back down the mountain, I stayed. When we had our first real argument yesterday, and I could have retreated to anger and distance, I stayed. When you admitted you were still planning around my departure, I stayed. Elena's dark eyes were steady on his. At some point, you're going to have to accept that I'm choosing this. Choosing you. Not as a last resort or because I have no alternatives, but because this is what I actually want. Caleb felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, but opening, letting in air and light and the terrifying possibility of hope. I'm trying, he said quietly. I know. So am I. Elena picked up her pencil again. Now help me figure out where the chicken coop should go. It needs to be close enough to manage easily, but far enough from the cabin that they don't wake us before dawn with their noise. They spent the rest of the morning planning, arguing good-naturedly about placement and priorities, mapping out a future that required them both to be present. And with each decision they made, each plan they committed to paper, Caleb felt the weight of his fear lighten slightly. It didn't disappear. He suspected it never fully would. 7 departures had carved deep grooves in his ability to trust good things. But Elena's steady presence, her practical planning, her refusal to be intimidated by his doubts, all of it was slowly filling those grooves with something new. Not quite belief. Not yet. but possibility. And for now, that was enough. Spring arrived slowly on the mountain, like a guest uncertain of its welcome. The snow began to retreat in patches, revealing muddy earth and the stubborn green of new growth pushing through frozen ground. The creek behind the cabin, silent and solid through winter, cracked and groaned as ice gave way to rushing water. And with the thaw came the first wagon. Caleb heard it before he saw it, the familiar jingle of harness bells echoing up through the valley on a morning in late March. He was in the barn checking on Atlas's foreleg when the sound reached him, and he felt his whole body tense. Elena appeared in the barn doorway, her expression unreadable. "The supply wagon," she said simply. "I hear it." They stood there for a moment, the unspoken question hanging between them. This was the test she'd talked about months ago, the first real opportunity for her to leave if she wanted to. "I should make a list," Elena said finally, "of what we need to order, the seeds we discussed, materials for the chicken coop, everything on our plan." "Right, the plan." She crossed the barn to stand beside him, her hand coming to rest on his arm, a brief touch that grounded him. "I'm not leaving, Caleb. Stop looking like someone preparing for disaster." "I'm not." "You are. I can see it in your face. That same expression you had when I first arrived, like you were already bracing for disappointment." She squeezed his arm. "The wagon is bringing supplies, not taking me away. You need to start believing that." The wagon pulled into the clearing 20 minutes later, driven by a man Caleb recognized, Jack Morrison, who made the mountain supply run 3 or 4 times a season. He was older than the driver who'd brought Elena, weathered and practical, with the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "Harper," he called down, setting the brake. "Heard you finally got yourself a wife who stuck. Wondered if it was true." "It's true," Caleb said, and felt Elena's presence beside him like an anchor. Jack's eyes moved to Elena, assessing her with the frank evaluation of someone who'd seen too many mail-order brides come and go from these mountains. "Mrs. Harper, pleasure to meet you. I'm guessing you'll be wanting supplies?" "Quite a lot of them, actually." Elena stepped forward, pulling a folded list from her apron pocket. "We're expanding our operation significantly this season." Jack took the list, his eyebrows climbing as he read. "Seeds, lumber, chickens, tools, fabric, building supplies. This is more than triple what Harper usually orders." "We're building for the long term now," Elena said calmly, "not just surviving season to season." Something shifted in Jack's expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. He'd probably seen too many ambitious plans from mountain wives who left before they could implement them. "I can get most of this," he said, folding the list and tucking it into out his coat. "Have to order some items special. Won't all come on the next wagon. Probably take 2, maybe 3 loads to get everything." "That's fine. We're not going anywhere." The simple certainty in Elena's voice made Caleb's chest tighten. She wasn't just saying it for Jack's benefit. She was saying it for his. After Jack had unhitched his team and accepted Elena's offer of coffee and breakfast, they sat around the cabin table while he caught them up on news from the valley and the towns beyond. "There's been some trouble down in Silver Creek," Jack said between bites of the eggs Elena had scrambled. "Mining dispute turned violent. 3 men dead, and the company's talking about shutting the whole operation down." "That'll hurt the whole region," Caleb said. "Half the businesses in Silver Creek depend on the miners' wages." "It's already hurting. Shops closing, families leaving. Town might not survive it." Jack took a long drink of coffee. "A lot of folks heading further west or back east. Hard times make people move." Caleb felt Elena's eyes on him, knowing what she was thinking. Hard times made people move, but not them. They were staying, building, investing in a future on this mountain regardless of what happened in the valleys below. Jack stayed through the afternoon, resting his horses and helping Caleb with some repairs to the barn's roof that needed 2 sets of hands. As they worked, he asked questions, careful, indirect questions that Caleb recognized as the man's way of assessing whether this marriage was real or just another temporary arrangement. "Your wife seems capable," Jack said, handing up a bundle of shingles. "She is. Got some steel in her, too. Saw it when she was making that supply list. Most women who come up here start out ambitious, but they soften the numbers when they realize how much work it actually takes." Elena doesn't soften anything." "Good. You need that on a mountain." Jack hammered in a nail with practiced efficiency. The last woman you had here, Rebecca, wasn't it? She seemed capable too, but she left anyway. She did. So what makes this one different? Caleb thought about how to answer that. He could talk about Elena's practical skills or her adaptability or her willingness to work. But that wasn't really what Jack was asking. She's not trying to be something she isn't, Caleb said finally. Rebecca was capable, but she was also trying to convince herself this life was what she wanted when it wasn't. Elena knows what this is, chose it deliberately, makes a difference. Jack nodded slowly. Sounds like you might have gotten lucky on the 8th try. Maybe. No maybe about it, Harper. Woman who'll stay through a mountain winter and still want to expand instead of escape? That's luck and good judgment combined. That evening, after Jack had bedded down in the loft and Elena had cleaned up from dinner, she and Caleb stood outside watching the last light fade from the western sky. The air was warmer than it had been in months, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine sap. He was testing you, Elena said quietly. Jack, all those questions about supplies and plans, he was trying to figure out if I was real or temporary. I know. Did I pass? Caleb glanced at her, at the way the fading light caught in her dark hair and the strong lines of her face. You impressed him. That's not easy to do. Good. She was quiet for a moment, then added, You know what the hardest part of today was? What? Watching you tense up when you heard the wagon, seeing that look in your eyes like you were preparing for me to announce I was leaving. Her voice was gentle but firm. We're 4 months into this marriage, Caleb. At some point, you're going to have to stop waiting for me to fail you. I'm not. You are. Every time something changes or someone new arrives or we have a disagreement, I can see you bracing for it. For the moment, I decide this isn't working. She turned to face him fully. What do I have to do to convince you I'm staying? Because apparently living here, working beside you, sharing your bed, and making plans for our future isn't enough. The frustration in her voice was real, and Caleb felt the weight of his own fear like a stone in his chest. I don't know, he admitted. I wish I did. I wish I could just believe it and stop waiting for disaster. But 7 women taught me that good things don't last, that people leave, and I don't know how to unlearn that. Elena studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. Then I'll just have to keep staying until you believe it, she said finally. However long that takes. Jack left the next morning with their supply order and a promise to return in 3 weeks with the first delivery. As they watched his wagon disappear down the trail, Caleb felt Elena's hand slip into his. First test passed, she said quietly. I didn't leave with him. I noticed. How many more tests do you need? I don't know. Probably too many. That's fine. I'm patient. She squeezed his hand. Now, let's go start building that chicken coop. If the supplies are coming in 3 weeks, we need to have the structure ready. They threw themselves into the work of spring with the intensity of people making up for lost time. The chicken coop went up in sections, Caleb building the frame while Elena measured and cut, both of them working in the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the winter. They expanded the garden plot, turning soil that hadn't been touched in years, Elena planning rows and sections with the precision of someone who'd studied crop rotation and companion planting. Where did you learn all this? Caleb asked one afternoon, watching her sketch out the garden layout with a stick in the dirt. Books mostly, and from watching my father work the ranch gardens in New Mexico. She added another row to her diagram. Food security matters when you're living this far from supply lines. We can't just rely on what we can buy or trade for. We need to produce as much as possible ourselves. You sound like you're planning for a siege. I'm planning for independence, for not being at the mercy of failed crops in the valley or supply wagons that can't make it through early snow. She looked up at him. This is our land, Caleb, our life. I want it to be as self-sufficient as possible. The possessiveness in her voice, our land, our life, sent a warm current through his chest. She wasn't just living here. She was claiming it, making it hers. 3 weeks later, Jack's wagon returned loaded with supplies, seeds in carefully labeled packets, lumber for expansion, a crate of chickens that squawked indignantly about their journey, tools and fabric and all the materials they'd need for the improvements they'd planned. Elena supervised the unloading with the efficiency of a quartermaster, directing where everything should go and checking items against her list. Jack watched with barely concealed amusement. "You run a tight operation, Mrs. Harper." "Someone has to," Elena replied without looking up from her inventory. Left to Caleb, half of this would sit in the barn for months before getting used. "She's not wrong," Caleb admitted. After Jack left with a new list of supplies for the next delivery, Caleb and Elena stood in the barn surrounded by their purchases. It was more than Caleb had bought in the previous 3 years combined. More investment, more commitment, more evidence that this wasn't temporary. "Second wagon came and went," Elena said, running her hand over a bundle of smooth lumber. "Still here." "I noticed." "How many more wagons before you stop counting?" Caleb looked at her, at the way she stood among the supplies for their future with complete confidence, and felt something shift in him. Not quite trust, not yet, but movement in that direction. "I'm trying, Elena." "I know you are." She crossed to him, reaching up to touch his face with dirt-stained fingers. "Just keep trying, that's all I ask." They planted the garden in early May, working side by side in soil that was finally warm enough to support new growth. Elena had arranged the rows with mathematical precision. Beans that would climb the corn stalks, squash that would shade the ground and prevent weeds, herbs interspersed throughout to repel pests. "This is more organized than any garden I've ever seen," Caleb said, pressing seeds into the earth at the intervals Elena had marked. "That's because most people plant randomly and hope for the best. I prefer systems." She moved down the row, her hands sure and practiced. "Everything has a purpose. Everything supports something else. That's how you maximize yield. You could write a book on this." "Maybe someday I will, when we're old and have nothing better to do than document our accumulated wisdom." The casual reference to growing old together made Caleb pause. Elena said it so naturally, as if their shared future was a foregone conclusion, rather than a hope still fragile with doubt. "You really see us that way?" he asked. "Old together?" Elena looked up from her planting. "How else would I see us? We're married. We're building a life. Unless you're planning to die young or send me away, growing old together is the logical outcome." "Most people call that assumption romantic. I call it practical." She brushed dirt from her hands. "Romance is about feelings. What we're building is about choices. And I choose this every day. The work, the mountain, you. That's more reliable than any feeling." That night, as they lay in bed with the windows open to let in the spring air, Elena spoke into the darkness with unusual hesitancy. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "When did you stop being angry at your sister for making you feel like you'd wasted your youth raising her?" The question surprised him. They hadn't talked about his sister in months. "I'm not sure I ever did stop," Caleb admitted. "I just learned to accept it as part of who I am. Someone who sacrificed years for someone else and got resentment instead of gratitude." "That must have hurt." "It did. Still does sometimes. But she was right to resent me. I kept her alive, but I didn't make her feel loved. There's a difference." Elena was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking in the darkness beside him. "What if we have a child who resents us?" she asked quietly. "Not because we're cruel or neglectful, but because we're not the warm, demonstrative kind of parents others have. What if we do our best and it still isn't enough?" "Is that what you're afraid of?" "Part of it. I'm afraid of repeating my parents' mistakes, my mother's emotional dependency, my father's emotional distance. I'm afraid of raising a child who feels unloved, even though we're providing everything they need." Her hand found his in the darkness. "But I'm more afraid of letting that fear stop us from trying." Caleb thought about the nursery they'd planned, the addition to the cabin that would make space for a child, about the terrifying responsibility of shaping another human being when he'd already proven he wasn't particularly good at it. "We'll probably make mistakes," he said finally. "We'll probably do things wrong and hurt feelings we didn't mean to hurt, but we'll also do it together. We'll talk about it, adjust, try to do better. That's more than most parents do." "Is that enough?" "I don't know, but it's what we have." Elena moved closer to him in the darkness, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. "Then it'll have to be enough." she said quietly. Because I think I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back or unhear. Caleb felt his entire body go still. You think, or you know? I know. I've missed 2 courses. I've been sick in the mornings. My body feels different. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the current of emotion underneath it. I wasn't planning to tell you yet. I wanted to be absolutely certain. But you asked what I was afraid of, and I realized I was more afraid of keeping it secret. Caleb's mind raced through implications and timeline. They'd been sharing a bed for 3 months. It was possible, more than possible. How do you feel about it? He asked carefully. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed, all of it at once. Elena's hand tightened on his. We said we wanted children eventually. We planned for them. But I didn't think it would happen this fast. I thought we'd have more time to be certain about each other first. Are you not certain? I'm certain I want to stay. Certain I want to build this life with you. But I'm not certain I'm ready to be a mother. To be responsible for shaping another person when I'm still figuring out how to be a good wife. The vulnerability in her voice cut through Caleb's own fear, reminding him that she was navigating uncertainty too, that she didn't have all the answers any more than he did. You'll be a good mother, he said quietly. You're practical and honest, and you don't pretend things are easier than they are. Children need that. Sit. What if I'm too honest? What if I'm so focused on being practical that I forget to be warm? Then I'll remind you, the same way you remind me to communicate instead of retreating into silence. He shifted so he could see her face in the darkness. We'll figure it out together, just like everything else. Elena's eyes were bright in the moonlight coming through the window. You're not angry that it happened before we planned? No. And he realized it was true. Somewhere between the fear and the shock was something else, a fierce protective instinct, a determination to do better than he'd done with his sister. I'm terrified, but I'm not angry. Good, because so am I. She managed a slight smile. We're going to be terrible at this, aren't we? Probably. At least at first. But we'll keep trying. We'll keep trying. They fell asleep like that, holding each other in the darkness, the knowledge of new life growing between them, adding weight to every promise they'd made. The next morning, Caleb woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Elena was already up, sitting at the table with her planning book open, making notes. We need to accelerate the timeline for the addition, she said without preamble. If the baby comes in December or January, we need the nursery finished before winter sets in hard. That's ambitious. So are we. She looked up at him. Can we do it? Build the addition and get it weatherproofed before the first snow? Caleb thought about the work involved, the foundation that would need to be laid, the walls framed and raised, the roof added, the finishing work that would make it livable. If we work every day, if the weather holds, if Jack can get us the materials we need on schedule. He sat down across from her. It's possible, barely. Then we'll make it happen. Elena's hand moved to her stomach in a gesture that was probably unconscious. This child deserves better than being crammed into our bedroom for the first year of its life. They threw themselves into the construction with single-minded determination. Caleb laid foundation stones while Elena measured and marked. They framed walls together, Caleb lifting heavy timbers while Elena secured them with the precision of someone who understood structural integrity. Jack's wagons brought materials on schedule, and Elena managed the supplies like a general managing an army's provisions. By midsummer, the frame was up and the roof was on. The new room extended from the eastern side of the cabin, positioned to catch the morning sun. It wasn't large, maybe 12 by 14 feet, but it was solid and tight and perfectly integrated with the existing structure. It's good work, Elena said, standing back to admire it. Her pregnancy was starting to show now, a gentle rounding of her belly that made her movements slightly more careful. It'll need finishing inside, proper floor, windows, plastering. We have time for that. The important part is done. It's enclosed and weatherproof. She turned to him with satisfaction. Our child will have their own space. That's what matters. Watching her stand there, one hand on her growing belly and the other gesturing at the room they'd built together, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Not quite the absence of fear. That was probably impossible for him. but a deeper certainty beneath the fear. This was real. This life they were building, this family they were creating. Elena wasn't going anywhere. She'd proved it through winter storms and spring planting and summer construction and the news of an unexpected pregnancy that could have sent her running. She'd stayed through all of it, was still staying. "What?" Elena asked, catching his expression. "Nothing, just, you were right." "About?" "About building something permanent. About investing in this life like it's our future." He moved to stand beside her, looking at the addition they'd created together. "I think I'm starting to believe it might actually work." Elena leaned against him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. "Only starting to believe? After all this?" "I'm a slow learner." Apparently. But there was warmth in her voice, and when she took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby was starting to show, he felt the reality of it sink in even deeper. This wasn't just about the two of them anymore. There was a third life depending on them to get this right, to build something stable and lasting and good enough to raise a child in. "We're going to make so many mistakes," Elena said quietly. "Yes. But we'll make them together." "Yes." That's enough, isn't it? To try together and fail together and keep trying anyway? Caleb thought about his sister, growing up with a brother who'd kept her alive but never made her feel loved. About 7 women who'd left because he hadn't known how to give them what they needed. About all the ways he'd failed at connection and relationship and the softer parts of being human. But he also thought about Elena's hand in his, about the life growing between them, about the room they'd built, and the garden they'd planted, and all the small daily choices that had brought them to this moment. "It's enough," he said. "It has to be." And standing there in the summer sunlight with Elena beside him, and their future literally taking shape beneath her heart, Caleb Harper allowed himself to believe, maybe not completely, maybe not without reservation, but genuinely, that this time might actually be different. That the 8th bride might be the one who stayed. Summer faded into autumn with the kind of golden beauty that made even practical people stop and stare. The aspen leaves turned brilliant yellow against the dark green of pine, and the air carried the sharp scent of coming winter. Elena's belly grew round and prominent, changing the way she moved through the world, but not slowing her down as much as Caleb had expected. "You're supposed to rest more," he said one afternoon in late September, finding her up on a ladder hanging the final curtains in the nursery. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," but she let him help her down anyway, her hand warm in his. "Besides, I want this room finished before the baby comes. Nesting instinct, I suppose." The nursery had come together beautifully over the summer months. Caleb had built a cradle from smooth pine, sanded until it was soft as silk. Elena had sewn bedding and curtains, her seamstress skills producing work far finer than anything they could have bought. They'd whitewashed the walls and installed a small stove for heat and positioned everything to maximize the morning light Elena insisted was important for a child's development. "It's perfect," Caleb said, looking around at what they'd created. "It's ready. That's different from perfect." Elena ran her hand along the cradle's edge. "But it's ours. That makes it good enough." That night, sitting by the fire after dinner, Elena brought up something that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "We need to talk about what happens when I go into labor." Caleb felt his stomach tighten. They'd been avoiding this conversation, both of them aware that childbirth on a mountain, miles from any doctor or midwife, carried risks neither of them wanted to articulate. "Jack said the woman in the next valley over has delivered most of the mountain babies for the past 20 years, Caleb offered. "Mrs. Chen. He could bring her up when the time comes." "That assumes we'll have warning. That assumes the trail will be passable. That assumes labor will be slow enough to send for help." Elena's voice was calm, but he heard the fear underneath. "We need a plan for if none of those things are true." "What kind of plan?" "The realistic kind. The kind where you might have to deliver this baby yourself if Mrs. Chen can't get here in time." The thought made Caleb's hands go cold. "I don't know anything about delivering babies." "Neither do I. First-time mother, remember?" Elena pulled a worn book from beside her chair. "But I've been reading, and I need you to read too, so at least one of us has some idea what we're doing if it comes to that." The book was a medical text, probably older than either of them, with detailed illustrations that made Caleb vaguely queasy. But Elena was right. Hope wasn't a plan, and they were too far from help to rely on everything going smoothly. They spent the next several evenings reading together, Elena making notes and asking questions, Caleb trying to memorize procedures he hoped he'd never need to use. It was terrifying and necessary in equal measure. "I'm scared," Elena admitted one night, closing the book with more force than necessary. "I've been trying not to be, trying to stay practical and focused, but I'm terrified something will go wrong and we'll be up here alone with no way to fix it." Caleb set aside his own fear long enough to pull her close, feeling the solid weight of her against him and the movement of their child between them. "So am I," he said honestly. "But we've survived everything else this mountain has thrown at us. We'll survive this too." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll do everything in my power to make sure you both come through it safely." He pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her. "You're not alone in this, Elena. Whatever happens, we face it together." She relaxed slightly in his arms, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Together," she repeated quietly. "I keep forgetting that's actually true now, that I don't have to handle everything by myself anymore. You've been alone a long time. So have you. We're both still learning how to be together instead of just beside each other." The first snow came in early November, lighter than the blizzard that had greeted Elena's arrival, but persistent enough to mark the true beginning of winter. Caleb stood at the window watching it fall, remembering the 7 women who'd looked at this same snow and decided they couldn't endure another season of it. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, coming to stand beside him. Her belly was enormous now, the baby due any day according to her calculations. "The others, the ones who left. Wondering if I'll change my mind when winter really sets in?" "No." And he realized it was true. Somewhere over the past 9 months, the fear of her leaving had transformed into simple certainty that she wouldn't. Just thinking about how different this feels from those years. How much lighter. Elena leaned against him, her hand finding his. "You know what's strange? I barely remember my life before this mountain, before you. It's like it happened to a different person." She paused. "Does that ever worry you? That we've both left our old selves behind so completely?" "Should it? I don't know. Most people warn against losing yourself in a relationship, but maybe we didn't lose ourselves. Maybe we just became different versions, better versions, than we were alone." Before Caleb could respond, Elena gasped, her hand tightening painfully on his arm. "What is it?" "I think..." She breathed slowly through her nose. "I think it's starting." The next 18 hours were the longest of Caleb's life. He sent word down the mountain with a passing trapper, hoping misses. Chen could make it through the fresh snow, but he knew help might not arrive in time. Elena's labor progressed slowly at first, giving them time to prepare everything they'd planned: clean linens, boiled water, the medical book open to the relevant pages. "This is nothing like the book described," Elena gasped between contractions as night fell. She was leaning against the bedroom wall, her face pale and sheened with sweat. "The book makes it sound orderly. This is chaos." "You're doing fine." "I'm not. I'm terrified, and it hurts, and I want my mother even though she's been dead for 12 years and wouldn't have been any help anyway." Her fingers dug into his arm as another contraction hit. "Tell me something, anything. Distract me." Caleb searched his mind desperately for words that might help. "When you first arrived, I was convinced you'd last 2 weeks maximum," he said. "You were too thin, too quiet, too different from what I thought I needed. I was already planning how I'd manage when you left." "Keep talking." Elena's breathing was ragged. "But then you stayed. Through the blizzard and the isolation and my terrible communication and every test that drove the others away. You stayed and you worked and you built this life with me like it was what you'd been waiting for your whole life." He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Elena. If you can survive me, you can survive this." She laughed, a harsh, breathless sound. "That's possibly the worst inspirational speech anyone's ever given a woman in labor." "I'm not good at speeches." "No, but you're good at other things, like building cradles and fixing roofs and being here when it matters." Another contraction made her cry out, and Caleb felt his own fear spike. How much longer? I don't know. The hours blurred together, pain and fear, and Elena's strength wearing down under the relentless assault of labor. Caleb did everything he could, supporting her when she needed to walk, holding her when the contractions made her legs shake, reading from the medical book with hands that trembled. Near dawn, when Elena was crying from exhaustion and Caleb was silently praying to anyone who might be listening, he heard it. Footsteps on the porch. A knock at the door. Mrs. Chen swept in like a force of nature, a tiny woman in her 60s with hands that moved with absolute confidence. She took one look at Elena and immediately began issuing orders in accented English. You, she said to Caleb. More hot water, clean towels, then stay close. She needs you. The next 2 hours passed in a haze of commands and encouragement, and Elena's determination pushing past the limits of what Caleb had thought humanly possible. Mrs. Chen worked with practiced efficiency, guiding Elena through each contraction, adjusting positions, offering reassurance in a voice that brooked no argument. And then, just as the sun was rising over the eastern peaks and turning the world gold the way Caleb had shown Elena on her first morning, their daughter was born. The sound of her first cry cut through the cabin like a bell, sharp and clear and impossibly alive. Mrs. Chen worked quickly, clearing airways and cutting the cord and wrapping the tiny body in clean linen before placing her on Elena's chest. Daughter, Mrs. Chen announced with satisfaction, healthy, strong lungs. Elena was crying, her hands shaking as she touched the baby's face with wonder. Caleb stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. This impossibly small person with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at him even though he knew newborns couldn't focus yet. Caleb, Elena said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Come here. Meet your daughter. He moved to the bed on legs that didn't feel entirely stable, looking down at his wife and child with emotions he had no names for. Elena shifted the baby slightly so he could see her better. She needs a name, Elena said. They'd discussed names over the summer, but never settled on anything, both of them superstitious about choosing too early. Now, looking at this tiny person they'd created, Caleb found himself thinking about the first morning he'd shared with Elena, about the gold light transforming the world, about the moment he'd known she understood why he'd chosen this life. Aurora, he said quietly, for the dawn, for new beginnings. Elena's eyes filled with fresh tears. Aurora Harper. Yes, that's perfect. Mrs. Chen stayed for 3 days, teaching them the basics of infant care and making sure both mother and baby were recovering properly. Elena proved to be a competent, if anxious, mother, and Caleb discovered that his hands, so skilled at carpentry and hunting, could be gentle enough to cradle something this fragile. On the morning Mrs. Chen left, she pulled Caleb aside while Elena was nursing the baby. You have good wife, she said bluntly. Strong, smart, not like other women who come to mountain and leave. I know. She stay because you worth staying for. You remember that when times get hard. When baby cries all night and wife is tired and you wonder if this was a mistake. Mrs. Chen poked him in the chest with one weathered finger. She chose you. She chose this. You honor that choice by being man worthy of it. After she left, Caleb stood at the window holding his daughter while Elena slept. Aurora was awake, her dark eyes wandering across his face with the unfocused curiosity of the very new. She was impossibly light in his arms, impossibly trusting, impossibly dependent on him to not fail her the way he'd failed his sister. I don't know how to do this, he whispered to her. I don't know how to be the kind of father you deserve, but I promise I'll try. I promise I'll keep trying, even when I get it wrong. That has to be worth something. Aurora made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite contentment, and her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. From the bed, Elena's voice came sleepy and warm. You're doing fine already. Stop doubting yourself. How long have you been awake? Long enough to hear you making promises to our daughter. She shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. Come here, all of us together. Caleb carried Aurora to the bed and settled beside Elena, the three of them fitting together in a way that felt both fragile and permanent. Through the window, the November sun was climbing higher, touching the snow with light. "We did it," Elena said softly. "Built something that lasts. We're still building it every day." "Yes, but now we know we can. That's different from hoping or planning." She looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. "You believe it now, don't you? That I'm staying, that this is real?" Caleb thought about the question honestly. The old fear was still there. Probably always would be, carved too deep by 7 departures to ever fully disappear. But it was quieter now, overlaid by something stronger. "Yes," he said. "I believe it." The words felt like a door opening, letting light into spaces that had been dark for too long. Winter settled over the mountain with its usual intensity, but the cabin felt warmer than it ever had before. The addition they'd built proved its worth, giving them space to organize the chaos of new parenthood while maintaining some semblance of their previous routines. Aurora was a surprisingly easy baby, fussy only when hungry or wet, sleeping in stretches long enough for Elena to recover from the exhaustion of childbirth. "She's too good," Elena said one night in late December, watching Aurora sleep peacefully in her cradle. "It's making me suspicious, like she's saving up all her difficult behavior for later." "Maybe she's just content. Some children are." "Were you content as a child?" Caleb thought back to his childhood on the Missouri farm, to the years before his parents died and everything changed. "I think so. I was quiet, preferred being alone, spent most of my time in the barn or the fields. My mother used to worry I was too isolated, but I was happy." He paused. "That's probably why I chose this life. It feels like returning to something I lost." "And now? Are you happy now?" The question should have been simple. It wasn't. Happiness had never been Caleb's goal. Survival, purpose, independence, yes, but not happiness. That had seemed too fragile a thing to build a life around. But looking at Elena holding their daughter, at the home they'd created together, at the life they'd built from honesty and work and stubborn determination, he realized something had shifted. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "I'm happy." Elena's smile was soft in the lamplight. "Good, so am I. Even when I'm exhausted and leaking milk and haven't slept more than 3 hours at a time in weeks, I'm happy." Christmas came quietly, just the 3 of them in the cabin with snow falling soft and steady outside. They'd made small gifts for each other. Caleb had carved a rocking chair for Elena to nurse in, and Elena had sewn him a new coat from wool she'd ordered specially and worked on in secret during Aurora's naps. "This is better than I thought it would be," Elena said that evening, rocking Aurora while Caleb added wood to the fire. "Being a mother, I mean. I thought I'd be terrible at it, too practical, too undemonstrative, too focused on function over feeling. You're doing fine." "I'm doing adequately. There's a difference." She looked down at Aurora's sleeping face. "But she seems content with adequate, and maybe that's enough. Maybe children don't need perfect parents. Maybe they just need present ones." "That's more than a lot of children get." "I know. I just want to be better than adequate for her, better than my parents were for me." Elena's voice was quiet. "I want her to grow up knowing she's loved, not just cared for. Wanted, not just tolerated. Do you think we can do that?" Caleb came to sit beside her, looking at his daughter's face with its perfect miniature features and the trust implicit in her sleep. "I think we're already doing it, questioning whether we're good enough, worrying about her well-being, wanting better for her than we had. That's love, Elena. Maybe not the dramatic kind that songs are written about, but the real kind that shows up every day and keeps trying. The fire instead of the lightning." Exactly. The new year arrived with brutal cold and clear skies. Caleb made the difficult trek down to the valley to send word to his sister, the first communication he'd initiated in 3 years. The letter was brief and factual, announcing Aurora's birth and Elena's continued presence, stating facts without embellishment because he didn't know how else to write. His sister's response arrived with Jack's first supply run of the new year, carried up through snow that made the journey nearly impossible. Caleb read it standing in the barn, not wanting to bring whatever it contained into the warmth of the cabin until he knew its contents. The letter was longer than any his sister had sent before, filled with surprise and what seemed like genuine warmth. She congratulated him on his marriage and fatherhood, expressed amazement that he'd finally found someone who could endure mountain life, and most surprisingly, apologized. "I know I was difficult to raise," she'd written. "I know I made you feel like a burden when you were doing your best to keep us both alive after mother and father died. I was young and scared and took my fear out on you. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I never thanked you properly for the years you gave up for me, and I'm glad you found people who choose you the way I never felt able to choose to stay." The words hit harder than Caleb had expected. He'd spent years carrying the weight of his failure with his sister, convinced it meant something fundamental was broken in him. But maybe she'd been right. Maybe they'd both been too young, too damaged by loss, too trapped in a situation neither of them had chosen. That didn't erase his mistakes, but it put them in a different context. He found Elena in the cabin, Aurora sleeping in her cradle while Elena worked on mending a stack of clothes that had accumulated. "My sister wrote back," he said, handing her the letter. Elena read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. When she finished, she looked up at him. "How does this make you feel?" "I'm not sure. Lighter, maybe. Like I can stop carrying around the guilt of failing her." He sat down across from Elena. "But also worried. If I failed her even when I was trying my best, what's to stop me from failing Aurora the same way?" "The fact that you're asking that question," Elena said immediately, "the fact that you're aware of the ways you can fail and actively working to avoid them, that's different from being 17 and overwhelmed and doing your best without any guidance or support." "You think that's enough? Self-awareness?" "I think it's a start. Combined with the fact that there are two of us this time, that we can call each other out when we're falling into old patterns, that we're building this deliberately instead of just surviving it." Elena reached across the space between them to take his hand. "You're not alone in this, Caleb. You don't have to carry the weight of parenting by yourself the way you carried the weight of raising your sister. We're partners, remember?" "Partners," Caleb repeated, the words settling into certainty. Spring came again, the third spring since Elena had arrived in a blizzard and chosen to stay. The garden they'd planted the year before had survived winter surprisingly well, and they expanded it further, Aurora watching from a basket while they worked. "She's going to grow up thinking this is normal," Elena said one afternoon, straightening from the planting with a hand pressed to her lower back. Mountains and isolation, and parents who communicate mostly through shared labor. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. It's different from how most children grow up. No playmates her own age, no school, no regular contact with other people besides the occasional supply wagon. Elena brushed dirt from her hands. "I want her to have what we have, the independence, the self-sufficiency, the peace of this life. But I also want her to have choices we didn't have. The option to leave if she wants to experience the world beyond this mountain. We can't give her everything. I know, but we can try to give her enough. Enough love and education and exposure to different ways of living that she can make informed choices when she's old enough." They stood together in the garden, watching Aurora grab at the sunlight filtering through the trees, and Caleb felt the weight of responsibility settle even deeper. This child would be shaped by their choices, their limitations, their strengths and weaknesses. That was terrifying and miraculous in equal measure. That summer, Jack brought news that shocked them both. "Your sister's coming," he announced, unloading supplies. "Sent word through the Denver office. She wants to visit, meet your wife and daughter. Should be here in about 3 weeks if the trail stays clear." Caleb felt Elena's eyes on him, questioning. "I didn't invite her," he said. "Didn't even know she was considering it." "Are you all right with this?" Elena asked after Jack had left. "Having her here? Confronting all that history?" "I don't know. Part of me thinks it's too late. Too many years of distance to bridge with one visit. But part of me wants her to see this. What we've built. Who I've become." He looked at Elena. "What do you think?" "I think it's your decision. But I also think facing the past might help you finally put it to rest." She shifted Aurora to her other hip. "And I'm curious to meet the person who taught you that you couldn't be loved." "She didn't teach me that. I learned it on my own." "Did you? Or did you learn it from her resentment and carry it forward into every relationship since?" Elena's voice was gentle but firm. Either way, having her here might help you see yourself differently, might help you finally believe what I've been trying to tell you for over a year. Which is? That you're worth staying for, worth loving, worth the effort it takes to build a life with you. His sister arrived on a warm afternoon in July, stepping down from Jack's wagon with the careful movements of someone unused to mountain travel. She was older than Caleb remembered, 32 now, with lines around her eyes and a maturity that softened the sharp edges of the girl he'd raised. "Caleb," she said, and there was uncertainty in her voice. "Thank you for letting me come. You didn't give me much choice. I know. I was afraid if I asked, you'd say no." She looked past him to where Elena stood holding Aurora. "You must be Elena. And this is Aurora?" The first few hours were awkward, all of them navigating the weight of history and the strangeness of connection. But as the afternoon wore into evening, something began to shift. His sister, her name was Margaret, which Caleb had somehow half forgotten through the years of distance, asked questions about their life, their routines, the choices that had led them here. "It suits you," she said after dinner, looking around the cabin. "This life, this isolation. I used to think you chose it because you hated people, but I understand now. You chose it because you needed space to be yourself without having to perform for anyone." "That's part of it," Caleb admitted. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to perform even in our own home, like you had to be something other than who you were just to make me comfortable." Margaret's voice was quiet. "I was young and stupid, and I thought love was supposed to look a certain way, demonstrative, effusive, constantly expressed. When you didn't give me that, I decided you didn't love me at all. But that wasn't fair. I should have tried harder, should have found ways to show you that mattered even if they didn't come naturally. Maybe, but you were also 17 and grieving and doing your best." She looked at Aurora, sleeping peacefully in Elena's arms. "Are you afraid of making the same mistakes with her?" The question was so direct it left Caleb momentarily speechless. Elena answered for him. "He's terrified, we both are, but we're facing it together instead of alone, and that makes a difference." Margaret nodded slowly. "I can see that. The way you are together, it's different from anything I expected. Not romantic in the traditional sense, but solid, real, built on something deeper than feeling." "That's exactly what it is," Elena said with satisfaction. "Something deeper than feeling." Margaret stayed for 3 days, and by the time Jack came to take her back down the mountain, something had shifted between brother and sister. Not complete reconciliation, too many years of distance for that, but acknowledgement, understanding. The beginning of a different relationship built on who they were now rather than who they'd been. "Write to me," Margaret said as she prepared to leave, "more than twice a year. Let me know how Aurora grows. Let me be part of your life even from a distance." "I will," Caleb promised, and meant it. After she was gone, Elena found him standing at the window watching the empty trail. "How do you feel?" "Lighter, like I've put down something I didn't realize I was still carrying." He turned to her. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making her welcome. For not being jealous or threatened by the history. For understanding that I needed to face it." "We're partners," Elena said simply. "Your past is part of you, which makes it part of us. Of course I wanted to understand it." That winter, their second full winter together, was the hardest in terms of weather, but the easiest in terms of living. They'd learned each other's rhythms completely by then, could work together without speaking, could navigate Aurora's needs and their own exhaustion with practiced efficiency. "She's walking," Elena announced one morning in February, watching Aurora take 3 shaky steps before sitting down hard. "Our daughter is walking." "She's too young for that." "Tell her that. She's stubborn. Probably gets it from both of us." They stood together watching their daughter master this new skill with single-minded determination, falling and getting up and trying again without hesitation. It was a perfect metaphor for everything they'd built. The falling and rising, the persistence, the refusal to stay down when life knocked them over. "We should have another," Elena said suddenly. Caleb looked at her in surprise. "Another child?" "Eventually, not right away. Let me survive this one's toddler years first. But yes, another child. Aurora shouldn't be alone up here. She should have siblings. You hated being an only child? Not hated, but I was lonely in ways I didn't understand until I was older. I don't want that for her. Elena watched Aurora toddle across the cabin floor. Besides, we're good at this. Better than we thought we'd be. We should do it again. The casual confidence in her voice made something warm spread through Caleb's chest. She wasn't asking if they could handle another child or if he thought they should try. She was simply stating that they would, as if it were as certain as the changing seasons. All right, he said, another child, when the time is right. When the time is right, Elena agreed. Spring came again, and with it the routine they'd established: garden expansion, supply wagons, improvements to the homestead. Aurora grew from a toddler into a small person with opinions and preferences and a stubborn streak that made both parents laugh in recognition. She's exactly like you, Elena said one afternoon, watching Aurora insist on carrying a bucket twice her size. She's exactly like you, Caleb countered. That determination is pure Elena Morales. Elena Harper, she corrected gently. I haven't been Morales in 2 years. Elena Harper, Caleb repeated, and the name felt right in his mouth. Complete. That evening, after Aurora was asleep and the cabin was settling into quiet, Elena brought out her planning book, the same one she'd used to organize their first spring together. I've been thinking about the future, she said, flipping to a fresh page. Not just next season or next year, but 10 years from now, 20. And I want to build something that outlasts us. Not just this cabin or this homestead, but something Aurora and her siblings can inherit and continue. A real legacy. She tapped her pencil against the paper. We should start documenting everything, the techniques we use, the lessons we learn, the mistakes we make, and how we correct them. So our children don't have to figure it all out from scratch the way we did. Caleb thought about his own childhood, about the knowledge his parents had taken with them when they died, forcing him and his sister to learn everything through painful trial and error. Like a manual for mountain living. Exactly, written by people who've actually done it, who know what works and what doesn't. Elena's eyes were bright with the same intensity she'd brought to every project they'd undertaken. We could leave them something valuable, not just property, but knowledge. We should do it. Yes? Yes. Start tonight. Write down everything we've learned so far, and we'll add to it as we learn more. So Elena began writing, and Caleb contributed his observations, and together they created a record of their life that was equal parts practical advice and inadvertent autobiography. In recording how to survive mountain winters and maintain livestock and preserve food for long months, they were also recording who they'd become together, what they'd built, how they'd learned to be partners instead of just two people occupying the same space. The summer Aurora turned 3, Elena's prediction came true. She was pregnant again. This time the news came with less fear and more confidence. They knew what to expect, knew they could handle it, knew that Mrs. Chen would come when the time was right, and everything would work out because it had to. Boy or girl? Aurora asked, patting Elena's growing belly with careful hands. We don't know yet. What do you hope for? Aurora thought about it with the seriousness of a 3-year-old making important decisions. Sister, so I can teach her things. And if it's a brother, then I teach him things. But harder, because boys are slower. Elena and Caleb exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both fighting smiles. Where did you learn that boys are slower? Caleb asked. Mama said it. When she was teaching me numbers and you couldn't remember what comes after 7. I was distracted, Caleb protested. You were slow, Aurora said with finality, and went back to playing with her wooden blocks. Their son was born in December, arriving just before the worst of winter set in. The labor was faster this time, and Mrs. Chen arrived with time to spare. They named him Thomas, not after Elena's first husband, but after Caleb's father, reclaiming the name and giving it new meaning. With 2 children, the cabin felt fuller and louder and more alive than ever. Aurora took her role as older sister with fierce seriousness, insisting on helping with everything and hovering over Thomas with protective vigilance. She's going to smother him with attention, Elena said one night, watching Aurora rock Thomas's cradle with exaggerated gentleness. She loves him. That's not a bad thing. No, but she needs to learn that love doesn't mean control, that people need space to grow and make their own mistakes. Elena looked at Caleb meaningfully. Sound familiar? He understood immediately. She was talking about how he'd raised his sister, managing instead of nurturing, protecting instead of allowing growth. We'll teach her balance, same as we're learning it ourselves. Same as we're learning it ourselves, Elena agreed. The years passed with the steady rhythm of mountain life. Aurora grew tall and capable, helping with chores almost before she was big enough to manage them. Thomas was quieter, more contemplative, content to observe before participating. They were different from each other, and different from what Caleb and Elena had expected, which was exactly as it should be. When Aurora was 7 and Thomas was 4, they expanded the cabin again. Another room, this time a shared space for the children that gave them privacy while keeping them close. Caleb built it the same way he'd built everything else on the homestead, carefully, deliberately, meant to last. We're building a compound, Elena joked, looking at the sprawling structure the cabin had become. At this rate, we'll have our own village by the time the children are grown. Is that a bad thing? No. Just different from what I imagined when I arrived. I thought it would always be just the two of us, learning to coexist in that small space. But this, she gestured at the expanded cabin, the productive garden, the chicken coop and barn and workshop. This is so much more than I hoped for. That evening, as they sat together watching the children play in the fading light, Caleb thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. 7 women who'd left, teaching him what he didn't want and couldn't be. Elena arriving in a blizzard, choosing to stay through every test and challenge, the slow building of trust and partnership, and something that looked like love, even if neither of them used that word very often. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Choosing this life? Giving up whatever options you had in Denver? Elena considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. I regret the fear, she said finally. The months we wasted being careful with each other instead of being honest. The time we lost protecting ourselves from disappointment instead of investing fully in what we were building. She looked at him directly. But I don't regret choosing you. Choosing this. Even on the hardest days, even when the children are screaming and the work is endless and I'm so tired I can barely stand, I don't regret it. Neither do I. Good. She leaned against him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Because you're stuck with me now. 8 years in, 2 children, a homestead that requires both of us to maintain. You can't get rid of me even if you wanted to. I don't want to. I know, I can finally believe that. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead and the children's laughter echoed across the clearing. This was the life they'd built, not perfect, not easy, not the romantic fantasy that stories promised, but real and solid and deliberately chosen, every single day. The man who'd watched 7 brides ride away had learned that love wasn't about lightning strikes or instant connection or magical understanding. It was about showing up, working together, choosing each other even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, building something slowly and carefully that could withstand whatever storms the mountain threw at it. And the woman who'd arrived in a blizzard, uncertain and guarded and determined not to repeat her past mistakes, had learned that partnership didn't require losing herself or performing a role or pretending to feel things she didn't. It required honesty in work and the courage to stay even when leaving would be easier. Together, they transformed a silent mountain into a living home. They'd created children who would grow up knowing that love could be quiet and steady instead of dramatic and consuming. They'd built a legacy that would outlast them both. The 8th bride had stayed, and in staying she'd taught the man who'd given up on connection that he'd been looking for the wrong things all along. He didn't need someone who couldn't live without him. He needed someone who could live perfectly well alone but chose to stay anyway. As winter settled over the mountain once more, wrapping the homestead in familiar white silence, Caleb Harper stood at the window with his wife beside him and his children sleeping soundly in the rooms they'd built with their own hands, and felt something he'd spent most of his life convinced was impossible. Complete. Not because someone else completed him, but because he'd finally built a life worth living instead of just surviving. Because he'd found a partner who understood that foundation mattered more than fireworks. Because he'd learned that the best things weren't the ones that came easily. They were the ones you built deliberately, one choice at a time, until they became permanent. The mountain wind howled outside, same as it had for decades before they'd arrived, and would for decades after they were gone. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the life they'd created together, there was warmth and light and the quiet certainty that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Not because fate or destiny had brought them together, but because they'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other, day after day, year after year, building something that would last long after the storms had passed.